Before dawn, Athens is not yet marble, it is stone, dust, thornbush, salt wind, and a dark hill rising over a small basin of land that seems too hard, too dry, and too narrow to become the beginning of anything vast. Long before philosophers walk through its streets, long before citizens lift their hands in the assembly, long before sculptors cut gods from white Pentelic marble, the place itself is already setting the terms. The mountains stand close, Hymettus to the east, Pentelicus to the northeast, Egaleo to the west, and the long broken ridges toward the south enclose Attica like a hand half closed around a shallow bowl. The soil is thin, rain comes unevenly, rivers are not great brown highways like the Nile or Euphrates, but seasonal threads, sometimes generous, sometimes nearly absent. To live here is to learn restraint. To farm here is to measure hope against rock. To build here is to understand that nothing abundant will arrive without effort. And yet, from this difficult ground, one of the most influential cities in human history begins to take shape. Not because nature gives Athens everything, but because it gives Athens just enough and withholds the rest. The landscape does not produce the easy wealth of a broad river plain. It produces olives, vines, figs, sheep, goats, clay, stone, silver in the hills of Laurion, and harbours opening toward the Aegean. It produces people who look outward because the land around them cannot answer every need. It produces a society that must bargain with scarcity, argue over land, send ships across water, and eventually turn the habit of public argument into a political force the world will still be debating more than 2,000 years later. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of Athens is not simply the story of democracy being born, clean and complete, like a statue lifted from the earth. It is the story of pressure. It is the story of a city shaped by hunger, memory, competition, pride, fear, and an almost dangerous confidence in words. It is a story in which freedom grows beside exclusion, philosophy rises beside imperial power, and beauty stands above streets where citizens accuse, persuade, condemn, and forgive one another in public. At the centre of it all stands the Acropolis. Today it seems impossible to imagine Athens without it: the high limestone rock, the ruined columns, the Parthenon glowing in sun, the city spread below in every direction. But the first power of the Acropolis is not artistic. It is geographical. It is a defensible height, steep-sided and visible from far away, a natural citadel above the plain, in a world where security matters as much as harvest. Such a place carries authority before anyone carves a temple on it. People climb it because it is safe. They remember it because it is seen. They sacralize it because human communities often make holy the places that protect them. The evidence remains incomplete for the earliest layers of Athenian life, and scholars still debate many details of how memory, settlement, and political identity developed here. But what survives in the record suggests a long, uneven continuity, not a single miraculous beginning. Athens does not suddenly appear in the 5th century BCE as a city of dramas and debates. It grows out of older settlements, older cults, older family claims, older fears. Beneath the classical city lies a deeper Athens, one of Bronze Age walls, early shrines, burials, pottery fragments, and stories that later generations will reshape into founding myths. In those stories, kings and heroes move through the land sea crops, erechtheos, Theseus. Their world is not history in the strict modern sense, but myth can preserve the emotional truth of a community. It tells later Athenians that they belong to the soil itself, that they are not recent arrivals, that Attica is not merely land they occupy, but land that has always, somehow, known their name. This attachment to place becomes one of Athens' most powerful ideas. The Athenians will later speak of being autochthonous, born from the earth of Attica, sprung from their own ground rather than planted by conquest from elsewhere. Modern historians treat that claim carefully. It is not a literal origin story. It is a political identity, a cultural memory, and at times a useful fiction. But in a rocky country where land is limited and lineage matters, the idea carries force. To say that one is born from the land is to claim a deeper right to it. It is to turn geography into belonging. It is to make the hills and fields part of citizenship itself. The land around Athens encourages this kind of thinking because Attica is both open and enclosed. Its mountains separate communities, but not completely. Its coast connects it to the Aegean, but not without risk. From the heights near Athens, the sea is never far away. The Saronic Gulf lies to the southwest, with routes toward Aegina, Corinth, the Peloponnese, and beyond. The Aegean opens eastward into islands scattered like stepping stones across blue water. For a poor farmer, the sea can look like danger. For a trader, it can look like opportunity. For a city, it can become destiny. The harbour of Piraeus is not fully transformed into the great naval base of Athens until later, but the possibility is always there in the shape of the coast. A city with poor grain land must find ways to reach other shores. It must exchange olive oil, pottery, metalwork, and ideas. It must know winds and seasons. It must think beyond its fields. This outward gaze matters. Athens's democracy will eventually be sustained by rowers, shipyards, imported grain, imperial tribute, and a maritime network stretching far beyond Attica. But the roots of that future lie in a simpler fact: the land alone is not enough. Scarcity does not automatically create liberty. It can create dependency, debt, violence, migration, and oligarchy. In early Athens, as in many ancient societies, the strongest families hold the best land and the deepest memories. They control marriages, cults, offices, and the stories that explain why their power is natural. The poor do not become citizens with equal voice simply because the soil is thin, but scarcity forces conflict into the open. When harvests fail or debts grow, when smallholders lose security, when aristocrats compete too fiercely among themselves, the city must find mechanisms to prevent its own fracture. Long before democracy becomes an ideal, Athens becomes a place where social pressure requires public solutions. This is one of the great hidden engines of the Athenian story. Democracy is often remembered as a bright invention of the mind, a political idea born from reason, but it is also born from land disputes, debt, warfare, class anxiety, aristocratic rivalry, and the need to organize men for defense. It rises not from peace, but from repeated crisis. The Athenian citizen will eventually stand in the assembly and vote, but behind that gesture lies a longer history of farmers on marginal soil, nobles defending privilege, craftsmen seeking status, sailors demanding recognition, and communities learning that power cannot remain forever locked inside a few households without consequence. The physical setting of Athens makes these tensions visible. The Acropolis rises above the city as sacred memory. Below it, the Agora will eventually become the civic heart, a broad open space where trade, politics, law, gossip, religion, and philosophy mingle in public. But even before the agora reaches its classical form, the idea of shared space matters. A polis is not only a settlement, it is a community that imagines itself as a body, however unequal, however contested. It needs places where decisions are seen, rituals are performed, disputes are heard, and identity is renewed. Athens' landscape gives the city a stage: the high rock, the open gathering places, the routes to the sea, the mountains holding the basin-like walls. There is a strange intimacy to Attica. It is not an empire-sized homeland. It is a region a determined traveller can cross. Villages, farms, sanctuaries, burial grounds, quarries, and coastal stations form a network of local worlds. Later democratic reformers will make this geography politically important by organising citizens through demes, the local communities of Attica. But even in the earliest phases, one can sense how the scattered landscape might force Athens to become more than an urban centre. To command Attica is to bind together hill farmers, coastal traders, inland aristocrats, craftsmen, priests, and sailors into one civic imagination. That binding is never easy. It must be invented, maintained, challenged, and repaired. The gods also live in the landscape. Athena, whose name becomes inseparable from the city, is not simply an ornament of myth. She is the divine expression of what Athens wants to believe about itself: intelligence joined to power, craft joined to war, order joined to daring. Poseidon, too, stands close in the city's imagination, god of the sea and earthquakes, a reminder that Athens' world is unstable both below and beyond. The famous contest between Athena and Poseidon for the city's patronage is myth, but myths often reveal what societies know about themselves. Athens exists between olive tree and salt water, between cultivation and voyage, between rootedness and risk. That double identity will never disappear. Athens will be a land power and a sea power, a sacred city and a commercial one, a conservative guardian of ancestral rights and a restless experiment in political invention. Its people will honour old families and then weaken them. They will celebrate freedom and build empire. They will create courts where ordinary citizens judge powerful men, and they will also exclude women, enslaved people, resident foreigners, and many others from the political voice that makes Athens famous. No single explanation fully accounts for this contradiction, because Athens itself is not one thing. It is an argument made of stone. So the story begins not with the word democracy, not with Socrates, not with the Parthenon, but with the land before those names become unavoidable. A hard country under a clear sky, a citadel above a basin, a coastline that invites departure, a soil that teaches limits, hills that hold memory, harbours that promise escape. From these elements, Athens begins its long transformation from settlement to polis, from local power to Mediterranean force, from a place among many Greek cities to a symbol that later civilizations will admire, misunderstand, criticize, and endlessly reuse. The first mystery of Athens is not how such a city could create democracy, philosophy, and classical art. The first mystery is how a landscape so demanding could become fertile in another way. Not fertile enough to feed everyone easily, perhaps, but fertile in conflict, invention, language, and political imagination. The earth of Attica does not give Athens comfort, it gives Athens friction, and from that friction, slowly, dangerously, the city begins to burn with ideas. Long before Athens learns to speak in the language of citizens and laws, It belongs to a world of palaces, warriors, storerooms, bronze weapons, seal stones, and kings whose names have become difficult to separate from legend. The Acropolis, already rising above the Attic plain like a stone back turned toward the sky, is not yet the open sanctuary of classical memory. In the late Bronze Age, it is a fortified place, part of the wider Mycenaean world that spreads across mainland Greece and reaches into islands, coasts, and trade routes far beyond what any single community can easily control. The later Athenians will remember this age through heroic stories, through names that seem larger than ordinary life. But beneath the poetry there is a harder archaeological shadow walls, tombs, pottery, weapons, administrative habits, and traces of a society that sees power as something concentrated, defended, and displayed. Athens in the Mycenaean period is not as dominant as Mycenae, Pylos, or Tiryns appear to have been, and scholars still debate the exact size, organization, and importance of the settlement on and around the Acropolis, but it is not empty. It is not a blank page waiting for democracy to arrive. The great rock already matters. At some point in the 13th century BCE, massive fortification works strengthened the Acropolis, including walls built in the heavy style later Greeks would call Cyclopean, as though only giants could have set such stones in place. There are also signs of careful planning for survival, including access to water within the fortified area, a practical detail that says more than myth ever could. A community that protects its water in a fortress understands danger. It expects crisis. It has seen enough of the world to know that enemies do not always announce themselves politely. The Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean is a connected world, and this matters deeply. Ships move metals, oil, textiles, timber, pottery, ideas, and people. Palaces keep accounts, elites exchange gifts, craftsmen learn techniques from far places. The Greeks of this period write in Linear B, a script used for administrative records, though not for the kind of public literature that later Athens will make famous. In those clay tablets, where they survive elsewhere, the world appears through lists. Rations, offerings, land, animals, labour, weapons. It is a world where power counts, stores, redistributes, and commands. Athens may not have left the same archive that Pylos did, but it exists within this broader civilization of palace centres, warrior elites, and sacred economies. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the atmosphere is clear enough before Athens becomes a city of public debate. Greek society has known a very different form of order. Then, around the end of the Bronze Age, that order begins to fail. Across the eastern Mediterranean, palaces burn or are abandoned, trade networks weaken, populations shift, writing disappears in much of Greece, and communities enter a long period that later generations once imagined as a dark age. Modern scholars treat that older phrase with caution. The centuries after the palace collapse are not simply darkness. They are transformation, fragmentation, adaptation, loss, and survival. But the change is real. The great centralized systems break apart. The old bureaucratic world fades. Skills continue in altered forms. Memories survive in stories, and people keep farming, burying their dead, worshipping gods, and rebuilding smaller worlds from the pieces of a larger one. Athens appears to have endured this transition with a degree of continuity, though the nature of that continuity is still debated. Later, Athenians like to believe that their city had never been conquered by the Dorians, never emptied and refounded like other places were imagined to have been. This belief feeds their claim to deep-rootedness in Attica. Modern archaeology does not simply accept civic pride as fact, but it does suggest that Athens was not erased. It shrinks, changes, and loses the complex structures of the Bronze Age world. Yet life continues. That continuity becomes politically powerful later, because a city that can tell itself it survived when others fell gains a special kind of confidence. It can imagine itself as old in a way that rivals cannot easily imitate. This is where myth enters not as decoration, but as cultural memory. The stories of early Athens are filled with kings who are more than king Cecrops. Half earthborn and strange, Erechtheus, bound to the Acropolis and the goddess Athena, Theseus, the great unifier who later tradition credits with bringing the scattered settlements of Attica into one political community. These figures do not belong to history in the plain documentary sense. They cannot be treated like elected archons or generals whose actions can be tested against inscriptions and dates. Yet they are not meaningless. They reveal what Athenians later needed their past to say. They needed a past of native birth, sacred protection, heroic unification, and ancient legitimacy. They needed to believe that the city's political body had roots deeper than recent convenience. The story of Theseus is especially revealing. In later Athenian imagination, he becomes the hero of Sinoicism, the drawing together of Attica's communities into a single civic order centered on Athens. Whether any single event like this occurred is uncertain, and most historians are careful not to turn myth into a simple report. The process was almost certainly long, uneven, and political. Local communities do not surrender identity easily. Families with ancestral cults, land claims, burial places, and local leaders do not become part of a wider city merely because a hero's name is attached to the act. But the myth preserves something important. Athens eventually understands itself not only as an urban settlement, but as the centre of all Attica. The city's future democracy will depend on that widened body of citizens. The myth of Theseus gives an ancient face to a social process that may have taken generations. In these post-palatial centuries, Athens is not yet the brilliant, noisy city of marble temples and philosophical quarrels. It is a settlement among settlements, trying to preserve identity in a world where old systems have failed. The evidence comes in fragments, pottery styles, burial customs, settlement traces, offerings, imported objects, changes in craft and trade. Such fragments do not speak with one voice. They require patience, and even then they leave silences. What survives in the record suggests that Athens participates in the gradual recovery of the Greek world. As communities grow, contacts widen, iron becomes more common, and social hierarchies take new forms. Power does not disappear after the palace age. It becomes more local, more aristocratic, more embedded in households and lineages. This is the world from which early Athens begins to move toward the polis. The word itself will come to mean more than a town. It will mean a political community, a shared identity, a system of belonging and obligation. But before such a community can exist, people must imagine themselves as part of something larger than a village, a clan, or a household. They must share festivals, myths, sanctuaries, defense, and memories. They must accept, or be forced to accept, that the center matters. The Acropolis helps this process because it is visible and sacred. The cult of Athena gathers meaning around the rock. Sacred places can do what laws cannot yet do. They can bind people emotionally before they are bound constitutionally. During these centuries, Greece as a whole begins to reawaken into wider contact. The alphabet appears, adapted from Phoenician models, and this is one of the quiet revolutions of the ancient world. Writing returns, but not in the same form as linear B-Palace accounting. Alphabetic writing can be learned more widely. It can record poetry, names, dedications, laws, and memory. Athens will later become a civilization of inscriptions, decrees, drama, argument, and philosophy. But the foundation is laid when words become durable again. The return of writing does not create democracy by itself. Many literate societies never become democratic, but it gives communities new ways to stabilize decisions, preserve claims, and make public acts visible beyond the moment of speech. The early religious life of Athens also deepens. Athena's presence on the Acropolis grows stronger. Local cults across Attica connect families and communities to particular places. Ritual does not merely express belief, it organizes time. Festivals bring people together, mark seasons, display status, renew alliances, and turn scattered inhabitants into participants in a shared world. A city before democracy is already learning public rhythm. It gathers, processes, sacrifices, remembers, and watches. The later assembly will not appear in a vacuum. It will emerge among people already accustomed to collective presence, even if collective authority still belongs unequally to the powerful. No single explanation fully accounts for Athens' survival and later rise. Geography matters, but geography alone does not create institutions. Memory matters, but memory can become fantasy. Trade matters, but many trading cities follow different paths. What makes Athens distinctive is the slow convergence of hard land, sacred center, local continuity, aristocratic competition, wider Aegean contact, and a civic imagination that begins to stretch across Attica. The city is not yet free in the later sense. It is not yet philosophical in the famous sense. It is not yet democratic in any meaningful sense. But it is gathering the ingredients that will make those later transformations possible. By the time Athens emerges more clearly into the archaic age, it carries with it this older inheritance of fortified rock from the Bronze Age, myths of earthborn kings, claims of unbroken belonging, sacred devotion to Athena, memories of unity under Theseus, and a landscape of villages gradually drawn toward one center. The palace world has vanished, but not everything has vanished with it. Some things endure precisely because they change form. Walls become sacred memory. Kings become heroes. Local survival becomes civic pride. A hard place becomes an ancient homeland. And beneath the future city of juries, assemblies, theatres, and philosophers, there remains the deeper Athens half archaeology, half myth, still whispering that before democracy could be imagined, the city first had to imagine itself. As Athens moves out of the long shadow of the palace age, the city does not become democratic all at once, or even clearly political in the later sense. It becomes something stranger and more gradual, a community learning how to see itself. The old citadel remains above the plain, but the meaning of the Acropolis begins to shift. It is no longer only a place of refuge and defence. It is becoming a sacred height, a visible memory, a place where the city's relationship with its gods can be staged before human eyes. Below it, scattered houses, workshops, paths, wells, burial areas, shrines, and open spaces begin to form the rough body of a polis. Not yet the Athens of Pericles, not yet the Athens of marble colonnades and packed courts, but already a city where land, cult, ancestry, and public gathering begin to tighten into a single civic world. A polis is easy to translate badly. It is often rendered simply as city-state, and that is useful enough. But it misses the emotional weight of the thing. A polis is not only walls, houses, fields, and officials. It is a community that believes it shares a destiny. It is a place where identity becomes political, where gods become civic protectors, where the dead are remembered in ways that strengthen the living, where local families and wider institutions compete to define what belonging means. The polis is not born from an abstract theory of government. It grows from rituals, disputes, marriages, property boundaries, military needs, feasts, funerals, and the repeated habit of gathering in common spaces until people begin to feel that the community itself is something more than the sum of its households. In Athens, this process is especially complex because Athens is not merely one dense settlement. It is the centre of Attica, a broader region of villages, coastlands, inland farms, mountain slopes, quarries, sanctuaries, and local identities. The city must become central without erasing every local attachment. The Athenians later imagine this unity through the figure of Theseus, but what survives in the record suggests a slower and more practical process. Local communities remain important. Families keep ancestral memories. Religious cults hold people to specific places. Yet increasingly, Athens draws these communities into a larger orbit. The Acropolis, the cult of Athena, shared festivals, legal habits, and aristocratic competition all help turn Attica into a political landscape centered on one city. The Acropolis rises at the heart of this transformation. Its sacred character grows during the early archaic period, and with that growth comes a new kind of visibility. Offerings accumulate. Rituals become public memory. The goddess Athena stands above the city not only as a divine patron, but as a way of imagining Athens itself. She is warlike, but not merely violent, skilled, but not merely practical, protective, but also demanding. The city's later self-image will cling to this combination. Athens wants to be clever and strong, cultivated and dangerous, lawful and bold. Athena gives divine form to that ambition. Her sanctuary makes the high rock more than a landmark. It becomes the vertical axis of civic identity, the place where the city looks upward and sees itself sanctified. Yet sacred unity does not mean social equality. Early Athens is still dominated by powerful families, the aristocratic houses whose names, marriages, land, and cult privileges give them authority. These families do not simply possess wealth, they possess memory. In a world where written law is still limited and institutions are still forming, memory itself can become power. A noble family can claim descent from a hero, control a priesthood, sponsor rituals, lead warriors, arbitrate disputes, and present its status as part of the natural order. The line between religion and politics is not sharp. A family that controls a cult controls access to divine favour. A man who speaks for ancestral custom can make inequality sound ancient, sacred, and inevitable. This is one of the quieter surprises of early Athens before democracy makes ordinary citizens visible. Aristocrats are the great performers of public life. They compete through funerals, athletic victories, dedications, feasts, poetry, and generosity. They display excellence, or what Greeks call aret, not as private virtue but as public superiority. A wealthy man does not merely own more, he must be seen to be more. He gives, leads, judges, fights, sponsors, and remembers. Status requires an audience, and because status requires an audience, the public world begins to expand. The aristocracy, in trying to dominate civic life, helps create the spaces and habits through which civic life can later challenge aristocratic domination. Burial customs reveal some of this tension. In earlier periods, elite graves and funerary display can mark social rank vividly, but over time, changes in burial practice suggest shifting attitudes toward public competition and communal order. Scholars still debate exactly how to interpret these changes, because grave goods, cemetery organization, and ritual behavior do not translate neatly into political systems, but they show that Athens is not static. It is negotiating how much display is acceptable, how power should appear, and how private family prestige relates to the wider community. Even the dead participate in the making of the polis, because every grave is also a statement about status, memory, and belonging. The living city grows through craft as well as cult. Potters shape clay from Attic earth into vessels that travel far beyond the fields that produce them. Long before Athens dominates the Aegean politically, its pottery begins to carry Athenian style outward. The famous black figure and later red figure traditions belong to later developments, but the earlier ceramic record already shows a community deeply invested in form, pattern, and exchange. A pot is never just a pot in archaeology. It is a trace of trade, taste, labour, technology, household practice, burial ritual, and social connection. Through pottery, Athens becomes visible in fragments across the Mediterranean world, long before its philosophers become famous. The growing public world also needs places below the Acropolis. The area that will become the Agora slowly emerges as a zone of gathering, exchange, and civic meaning. In the classical period, it will be the heart of Athenian public life, surrounded by stoas, altars, law courts, administrative buildings, monuments, and shops. But its earlier development is gradual. Open space in an ancient city is never empty in the modern sense. It is potential. It allows markets to form, processions to pass, decisions to be witnessed, disputes to be heard, and memory to be anchored. As Athens becomes a polis, it needs such spaces because politics cannot remain hidden inside households forever. Power must appear somewhere. Still, the early polis is not a democracy waiting patiently to happen. It is a contested aristocratic community with developing institutions, uncertain boundaries, and a growing sense of collective identity. There are magistrates, councils, religious offices, and customary rules, but much remains in the hands of the well-born. The common people are part of the city, yet their political role is limited. Farmers, craftsmen, herders, sailors, and labourers sustain the community, serve in war, attend festivals, and participate in local life. But the language of full public authority has not yet widened to include them as equals. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single surviving source lets us watch the formation of Athenian institutions moment by moment. What can be seen instead is the pressure building beneath them. That pressure comes from the very success of the polis. As Athens grows more integrated, conflict becomes more dangerous. When people think of themselves as part of one community, inequality within that community becomes harder to ignore. When aristocrats compete for leadership, their rivalry can destabilize everyone. When trade expands, new wealth may not fit old hierarchies. When small farmers face debt, land loss, or dependence, private suffering becomes a public problem. The polis creates a shared world, and then that shared world must confront the fact that its members do not share power equally. Religion helps hold the city together, but it also displays its hierarchy. Festivals bring Athenians into common rhythm, yet leading families often control the most prestigious roles: sacrifice, procession, and dedication give the city visible unity while reminding everyone who stands closest to honour. This mixture of inclusion and exclusion is central to Athens from the beginning. The city learns to gather people before it learns to empower them. It teaches them to witness public acts before it teaches them to govern. It makes a civic audience before it creates a citizen democracy. That sequence matters. Democracy will not fall from the sky. It will emerge from a society already trained in public attention. By the end of this slow formation, Athens has become more than a memory of Bronze Age walls and heroic kings. It is now a polis with sacred centres, aristocratic offices, local communities tied to a larger identity, emerging public spaces, expanding craft production, and a growing tension between old privilege and common belonging. Its people do not yet know that later generations will call their city the birthplace of democracy. They do not know that the Acropolis will become a symbol recognized across the world. They do not know that the open spaces below the sacred rock will one day hear arguments about justice, empire, law, and the soul. But the stage is being built. The city has learned to gather. It has learned to remember. It has learned to display power in public. And once power appears in public, others begin to wonder why it should remain forever in the same hands. As Athens becomes a polis, its public life grows brighter, but the hands that hold real power remain few. The city has learned to gather, to worship together, to imagine Attica as a wider civic body. Yet the centre of authority still lies with aristocratic families whose influence reaches through land, ancestry, priesthoods, military leadership, and custom. Their power does not need to announce itself as tyranny, because it is older and quieter than that. It is woven into who owns the best fields, who can call on dependents, who knows the unwritten rules, who has the confidence to speak in public, who can claim heroic descent, who can afford horses, armour, feasts, and funerals that remind everyone of rank. In early Athens, inequality is not hidden. It is performed. The city is not yet governed by the mass of citizens in the later democratic sense. Offices are held by men from elite circles, especially the archons, whose authority in law, religion, and administration gives aristocratic rule a civic face. There is also a council associated with the Areopagus, the hill of Ares northwest of the Acropolis, which becomes a symbol of old authority, legal memory, and elite supervision. Later Athenians will argue fiercely over how much power such bodies should keep. But in this earlier world their prestige rests partly on the weight of tradition. They appear not as inventions, but as inheritances. That is one of the strongest tools of aristocracy. It presents its control not as a choice, but as the way things have always been. Yet Athens is changing beneath that old surface. Population grows, trade widens, craft production becomes more important. More men outside the oldest families acquire wealth, ambition, or military usefulness. The polis creates a broader public identity, but the distribution of power remains narrow. This mismatch becomes dangerous. A farmer may serve the city, attend its festivals, honour its gods, and identify as Athenian, yet still find himself vulnerable to debt and dependent on men who claim to speak for the whole community. A craftsman may help fill the city with useful goods, but status still favours birth and land. A rising man may have money, but not the ancestry that opens every door. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests a society where the old aristocratic order is no longer strong enough to feel unquestioned, yet still strong enough to block easy change. Debt becomes one of the most explosive pressures. In a landscape like Attica, farming is never entirely secure. Thin soils and irregular rainfall can make smallholders vulnerable. A bad harvest does not only mean hunger, it can mean borrowing. Borrowing can mean dependence. Dependence can become bondage. Ancient sources later describe Athenians falling into debt slavery, or losing control of their land under harsh obligations. And while scholars still debate the exact legal and economic details, the broad crisis is difficult to dismiss. The language of later reform remembers a city in which ordinary people feel trapped, and where the land itself may have been marked by obligations owed to creditors. Whether every detail has been preserved accurately or reshaped by later political memory. The emotional core is clear. Many Athenians come to believe that the city is being consumed from within. Land hunger sharpens the conflict. In an agrarian society, land is not merely property, it is security, honour, ancestry, survival, and political standing. A household with land has a claim to independence. A household without it must negotiate life through labour, dependency, migration, or service to others. The aristocracy's grip on land therefore carries more than economic weight. It decides who can stand upright in the community and who must bow to necessity. The later democratic citizen ideal depends on the idea that free men should not live as the personal dependents of other Athenians. But before that ideal can be articulated in law, the opposite reality presses hard against the city's conscience. A polis cannot easily call itself one community if a portion of its people feels that membership has become a road into humiliation. Factional rivalry among the elite makes the danger worse. Aristocratic families compete for office, prestige, followers, and influence. Their conflicts are not private arguments sealed inside noble houses. They spill into the city. A powerful man can gather supporters through kinship, debt, patronage, and regional loyalty. Another can do the same. Competition that once may have displayed excellence begins to threaten civic order. Athens is not unique in this. Across the Greek world, archaic cities often struggle with stasis, the bitter internal conflict that can divide a polis against itself. Stasis is more than disagreement. It is the fear that a community's shared identity may tear apart under the pressure of rival groups claiming justice, honour, or survival. This is the dark underside of the polis. The same shared political space that makes common life possible also makes conflict unavoidable. When power is concentrated in noble families, those outside the circle resent exclusion. When ambitious aristocrats fight one another, they may appeal to broader groups for support. When the poor are desperate, reform becomes urgent. When the rich fear losing status, they resist. No single explanation fully accounts for the crisis that overtakes Athens. Because economic distress, social ambition, regional rivalry, and aristocratic competition all feed one another. But by the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, the city seems to be approaching a breaking point. One episode from this tense world is the attempted seizure of power by Solon, an aristocrat and Olympic victor, remembered as trying to make himself tyrant in Athens. The details are tangled, and later accounts carry their own political meanings, but the event reveals the atmosphere of instability. Solon's attempt fails, and the aftermath stains Athenian memory because of the religious pollution associated with the killing of his supporters after they had sought sanctuary. The story matters not only because of the bloodline politics that follow, especially the shadow cast on the powerful Alcmaeonid family, but because it shows a city where aristocratic competition has reached the point of attempted tyranny. Athens is not calmly evolving toward democracy. It is flirting with breakdown. This is also the period in which written law begins to matter more sharply. Draco, traditionally associated with the late 7th century BCE, becomes famous for harsh laws, especially in homicide. The severity later attached to his name may be exaggerated in popular memory, but the appearance of written law itself is crucial. To write law down is to change the relationship between power and knowledge. Custom held in elite memory can be flexible in the hands of those who interpret it. Public law, however harsh, has different force. It can be seen, cited, contested, and remembered. It does not make Athens equal. It does not end aristocratic rule. But it marks a step away from a world where justice depends entirely on the authority of powerful men. Still, law without social repair cannot save the city. Harsh penalties do not feed indebted farmers. Written rules do not dissolve faction. The old families may remain proud, but pride does not settle the question of how a community survives when too many of its members feel crushed by obligation. The crisis in Athens is not merely moral, it is structural. A city that has grown into a polis needs institutions wide enough to contain its own people. The aristocratic order has helped create public life, but now public life has become too large to remain aristocratic in the old way. The surprising thing is that Athens does not yet choose revolution. It does not immediately destroy the old families, redistribute everything, or hand power to the poorer citizens. The path it takes is more complicated, and in some ways more revealing. It turns to compromise. It turns to law-giving. It turns to a figure who is elite enough to be trusted by the powerful, yet remembered as sympathetic enough to address the suffering of the many. The city needs someone who can stand between fear and revenge, between memory and necessity, between the old order and a future no one can fully imagine. Athens has reached the point where custom is no longer enough, but democracy has not yet been born. In that narrow and dangerous space, the name Solon begins to rise. Solon enters Athenian memory not as a conqueror, not as a king, and not as a prophet arriving with a perfect design for freedom, but as a man asked to walk into a city close to tearing itself apart. The old aristocratic order still has land, prestige, and sacred authority. Yet its grip has begun to look dangerous even to itself. Poorer Athenians feel the pressure of debt and dependence. Ambitious families fear one another as much as they fear anger from below. The written laws associated with Draco have made justice more visible, but they have not healed the deeper wound. Athens needs a solution strong enough to prevent revolt, but restrained enough to avoid revenge. That is the narrow space in which Solon becomes possible. He's remembered as a lawgiver, though that word can sound too calm for the task before him. In an archaic Greek city, such a figure is a crisis manager and mediator, working while every faction watches. Solon belongs to the elite, so the powerful can listen to him without feeling that the city has been surrendered to their enemies. But later tradition also presents him as someone who understands that the suffering of ordinary Athenians cannot simply be dismissed as disorder. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact sequence and detail of his reforms, but the outline is clear enough to feel the shock of what he attempts. He tries to save Athens by forcing both sides to accept less than they want. The most famous measure is the shaking off of burdens, often known by the Greek term seisachtheia. Later Athenians remember it as a dramatic release from debt obligations, including the ending of debt bondage among citizens and the removal of markers that had stood on land as visible signs of obligation. The precise economic mechanics remain debated, because later sources describe the reforms from a distance and through later political concerns, but the meaning is unmistakable. Solon attacks the idea that an Athenian can be reduced to dependence on another Athenian through debt. He does not abolish inequality. He does not create an egalitarian society. But he draws a line around the body of the citizen and says, in effect, that the city cannot survive if free Athenians are consumed as collateral. In many ancient societies, debt and dependency are ordinary facts of life, woven into household economies and elite power. To limit that relationship inside the citizen body changes the moral structure of the polis. Freedom begins to acquire a civic meaning. It is not yet the full participatory freedom later Athenians will celebrate, but it is a foundation. A man who is not personally dominated by a creditor is more available to become a citizen in a political sense. The reform does not make all Athenians equal, yet it weakens one of the mechanisms by which inequality can become personal subjugation. It turns private suffering into a public concern. Still, Solon refuses to go as far as the poorest may have hoped. He does not divide the land into equal shares. He does not destroy the aristocracy. He does not erase class hierarchy. To the wealthy, he goes too far because he cancels obligations and interrupts expected profit. To the poor, he does not go far enough because land remains unevenly held and status remains unequal. No single explanation fully accounts for how his settlement was received. But later tradition preserves the feeling of complaints from both sides. That is the nature of his achievement. Solon does not satisfy Athens. He prevents it, for a time, from breaking. His political reforms are just as important. Though less easily imagined than debt relief, Solon reorganizes political status around property classes rather than pure birth, at least in the form remembered by later Athenians. The highest class, the pentakosiomedimnoi, are those with the greatest agricultural yield. Beneath them stand the hippes, wealthy enough in traditional terms to maintain a horse, then the zeugitai, often associated with middling farmers able to equip themselves as hoplites, and below them the thetes, the poorest citizens. This classification openly preserves hierarchy. Higher offices remain attached to wealth, yet the shift matters because it weakens the exclusive political language of noble birth and makes wealth, military capacity, and civic contribution part of the structure of status. The poorer citizens gain a place in the public order, though a limited one. They may not yet command the highest offices, but they are not outside the political imagination. Solon is credited with strengthening the assembly and allowing appeals to a popular court, measures whose exact original form scholars continue to examine with caution. Yet the direction matters. The city begins to imagine that justice cannot belong only to magistrates and aristocratic councils. A citizen wronged by an official may have somewhere to turn. Public judgment begins to widen. The later democratic jury courts do not appear fully formed in Solon's hands, but a path opens toward them. Athens is learning that law becomes stronger when ordinary citizens have a role in guarding it. The transformation is subtle but decisive. Law becomes a framework through which conflict can be contained. Class becomes organized in civic terms. Office becomes connected to declared qualifications. Appeal becomes imaginable. The community is no longer only a stage on which aristocrats compete. It is becoming a structure in which different ranks of citizens have recognized places. This is not democracy yet, but it is one of democracy's necessary ancestors. Later stories make Solon seem almost impossibly wise, a man who solves every problem through moderation, but that image should be treated carefully. What survives in the record suggests not a perfect architect, but a practical reformer under extreme pressure, trying to create enough order for the city to continue. His achievement is profound because it remains incomplete. He gives Athens a way to think about freedom, but not yet equal freedom. He opens legal and political space, but does not hand the city to the masses. He limits aristocratic dominance, but does not end aristocratic influence. The emotional texture of the moment is easy to miss if Solon is treated only as a name in constitutional history. Debt markers disappear from fields where families have walked for generations. Men who feared permanent dependence discover that their status as Athenians still means something. Creditors watch, expected control vanish under the authority of law. Poorer citizens realize that liberation has come without land redistribution. Relief and resentment live side by side. The city breathes, but uneasily. Solon himself is said to have left Athens after his reforms, a detail later tradition makes almost poetic, as though he must absent himself so the city cannot force him to undo what he has done. Whether the story is polished by memory or not, it captures a political truth. A compromise needs time to harden into habit. If the lawgiver remains too close, every disappointed faction will try to bend him. By leaving, Solon becomes less a man and more a settlement. The laws stand where personal persuasion once stood. But Athens is not cured. The old rivalries continue. Regional factions, aristocratic ambitions, and popular frustrations remain alive beneath the new order. Solon has changed the terms of conflict, not abolished conflict itself. That is perhaps the most Athenian thing about his legacy. He does not silence the city. He gives it new language in which to argue. Debt, law, class, office, freedom, appeal, citizenship. These become tools with which Athenians will continue to fight over what kind of community they are becoming. The dangerous compromise holds back collapse, but it also reveals a new possibility. If laws can be remade, then power is not entirely sacred. If citizens can be protected from bondage to other citizens, then belonging has force. If political status can be arranged by civic categories rather than old blood alone, then the polis is something human beings can redesign. Solon does not create democracy, but he makes Athens thinkable as a constructed political order. And once a city learns that its own foundations can be changed, it becomes very difficult to convince its people that the future must obey the past forever. Solon's compromise gives Athens room to breathe, but breathing is not the same as healing. The city has laws, categories, protections, and a new political imagination, yet the forces that nearly tore it apart remain alive beneath the surface. Aristocratic families still compete for influence. Regional loyalties still matter. Poorer citizens may have been released from the worst forms of debt dependence, but they have not been transformed to a secure and satisfied class. The rich have lost some power, but not enough to stop seeking more. The poor have gained protection, but not enough to forget grievance. Athens has avoided one kind of collapse, only to enter another kind of uncertainty. In that uncertainty, tyranny becomes possible. The word tyranny now carries a dark, almost automatic meaning. But in archaic Greece it does not always begin as the rule of a monster. A tyrant is a man who takes power outside the normal inherited or constitutional channels, often by gathering supporters against an established elite. He may be violent, calculating, generous, popular, cruel, or all of these at different moments. Tyranny is dangerous because it concentrates power in one man's hands, but it can also appear, at first, as a solution to aristocratic chaos. In a city exhausted by noble rivalry, a single strong ruler may seem less frightening than many proud families pulling the polis apart. Pisistratus rises from this world of fractured loyalties. He is an aristocrat himself, which is important. He is not an outsider storming the city from below. He belongs to the class whose rivalries have destabilized Athens, yet he knows how to present himself as something more than another noble competitor. He cultivates support among poorer Athenians, especially those in less favored regions, and he turns social resentment into political strength. Later sources describe his path to power through episodes that are partly dramatic, partly suspicious, and partly shaped by storytelling staged wounds, bodyguards, exile, return, alliances, and repeated seizures of control. Scholars still debate details of these accounts, because later Greek writers loved moral patterns and memorable scenes. But the broad reality remains clear. Pisistratus succeeds where Solon failed. He becomes tyrant of Athens. His rule is one of the great paradoxes in the making of Athenian democracy. It is not democratic, yet it helps prepare the city that will later become democratic. It suppresses some aristocratic independence, yet it may ease tensions among ordinary people. It concentrates authority, yet it strengthens the central city. It is personal rule, yet it encourages public works, religious festivals, and economic development that deepen the shared identity of Athens. No single explanation fully accounts for this contradiction, because Pisistratus is neither a simple villain nor a secret democrat. He is a tyrant trying to preserve his own power, and in doing so he changes the city in ways he cannot fully control. One of his most important achievements is stability. After decades of factional pressure, Athens under Pisistratus experiences a degree of order. Aristocratic rivals are managed, exiled, reconciled, or contained. Local tensions do not vanish, but they are no longer allowed to dominate the city in the same way. For poorer farmers, tradition later remembers Pisistratus as relatively mild, even helpful, offering loans and encouraging agricultural production. This image may be partly shaped by later contrast with harsher tyrannies, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet it suggests something politically important. Tyranny can win acceptance when it seems to make daily life more predictable. People do not always measure government first by abstract freedom. They may measure it by whether fields can be worked, disputes settled, roads used, festivals celebrated, and powerful families restrained. Pisistratus also understands the power of religion and spectacle. He promotes cults and festivals that bind Athens more tightly together, and among them, the Panathenaea grows in importance as a great civic celebration of Athena. Such festivals are not mere decoration. They are political theatre in the deepest sense. Processions move through the city. Citizens see themselves as part of a larger body. The goddess above the Acropolis becomes the focus of collective identity. Local Attic communities are drawn toward the centre not only by law or force, but by ritual rhythm. A tyrant who strengthens public religion is not simply being pious. He is teaching the city to imagine itself as one. The city Dionysia also develops in this wider atmosphere of festival culture, and here the future of Athens begins to take a form that Pisistratus could never have fully foreseen. The dramatic competitions associated with Dionysus will become one of the defining institutions of classical Athens, a place where tragedy and comedy examine power, justice, pride, suffering, war, family, gods, and civic responsibility. In the time of the tyrants, the foundations of this public theatrical culture are still emerging, but the direction matters. Athens is learning to gather not only to sacrifice or trade, but to watch stories together. A city that watches itself through myth will later become a city capable of arguing with itself through drama. Public building also changes the city's physical presence. The Pisistratid period is associated with temples, waterworks, roads, and improvements that help Athens feel more like a central polis, rather than merely the stronger settlement in Attica. One famous project connected to this age is the fountain house known as the Krounos, linked in tradition with efforts to improve the city's water supply. Whether every attribution is secure remains debated, but the broader pattern fits the needs of tyranny. A ruler who provides useful works gains loyalty and visibility. Stone, water, roads, and sanctuaries become arguments in favor of his rule. The city itself begins to bear the marks of centralized power. There is something almost ironic in this. The tyrant makes Athens more public. He weakens some private aristocratic rivalries by concentrating authority in his own house. He elevates festivals in which citizens appear together. He supports economic and religious structures that strengthen the identity of the polis. He may even allow many Solonian laws and offices to continue operating beneath his supremacy. Tyranny does not erase the civic framework. It sits above it. That means Athenians continue to live inside institutions, categories, and laws even while ultimate power belongs to one family. The habit of civic order survives under personal rule. Pisistratus dies and power passes to his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus. At first, the regime continues, but inherited tyranny is rarely as stable as the founder's rule. The sons possess the structure their father built, but not necessarily the same political balance. The famous killing of Hipparchus by Harmodius and Aristogeiton later becomes one of Athens's great liberation stories, celebrated in song, sculpture, and democratic memory. Yet the reality is more complicated. Their act seems to have grown from personal and elite tensions as much as from a pure democratic uprising, and Hippias remains in power afterward. Still, the assassination changes the atmosphere. Hippias becomes harsher and more suspicious. A regime that once seemed manageable begins to feel oppressive. The fall of the tyranny comes not simply through heroic resistance inside Athens, but through aristocratic maneuvering, exile politics, religious influence, and Spartan intervention. The powerful Alcmaeonid family, long shadowed by earlier pollution stories and later central to Athenian politics, plays a role in opposition. Sparta eventually helps drive Hippias out in 510 BCE. The Athenians later prefer to remember themselves as tyrant slayers. And democratic memory has a way of polishing events until civic pride shines through the cracks. But what survives in the record suggests a more tangled truth. Freedom arrives through a mixture of internal resentment, elite rivalry, outside force, and political opportunity. When Hippias is gone, Athens is not automatically democratic. The removal of a tyrant creates a vacuum, and old aristocratic competition quickly returns. Powerful men again struggle to shape the city's future. The danger is clear. Athens might fall back into faction, or another strong man might rise. Yet tyranny has changed the terrain. It has strengthened the central city, deepened civic festivals, weakened certain aristocratic patterns, preserved and used Solonian institutions, and taught Athenians both the appeal and the danger of concentrated power. They have seen order without freedom. They have seen public life under one family's control. They have seen how easily stability can harden into fear. This experience matters because Athens will soon make one of the most radical political reorganizations in Greek history. It will not do so from innocence. It will do so after debt crisis, law reform, aristocratic rivalry, tyranny, assassination, exile, and foreign intervention. The birth of democracy is not a gentle sunrise over the Acropolis. It is the next move in a city that has already learned how fragile common life can be. Pisistratus and his sons do not create democracy, but by ruling Athens, beautifying it, centralizing it, and frightening it, they help make the old order impossible to restore unchanged. The city has passed through tyranny, and it has come out with a dangerous lesson. If power can be seized by one man, then perhaps it can also be deliberately broken apart and redistributed among many. The fall of Hippias leaves Athens free from one ruling family, but not yet free from the older danger that has haunted the city for generations. Power has slipped out of the hands of the tyrant, and immediately the aristocrats begin reaching for it again. The old names, old rivalries, and old networks return into the open. Athens has not become a democracy simply because tyranny has ended. A city can remove a strong man and still fall back into oligarchy, faction, or another form of domination. The question after 510 BCE is not whether Athenians dislike tyranny. Many clearly do. The deeper question is whether they can build a political order strong enough to prevent tyranny, aristocratic monopoly, and civic collapse from returning in a new shape. Two figures stand at the centre of this dangerous moment, Cleisthenes and Isagoras. Both are aristocrats. That detail matters, because the next great step toward democracy does not begin as a pure uprising of the poor against the rich. It begins inside elite competition, in a struggle between powerful men trying to command the future of the city. Isagoras has support among aristocratic circles and, crucially, from Sparta. Cleisthenes belongs to the Alcmaeonid family, wealthy, ambitious, and politically experienced. At first glance, this looks like the familiar pattern: noble houses fighting for leadership while the broader citizen body waits to see which faction wins. But Cleisthenes makes a move that changes the logic of the struggle. He turns toward the people. Later sources describe Cleisthenes as taking the demos into partnership, and the phrase captures the shock of the moment even if the exact sequence remains debated. The people of Athens are no longer merely an audience for aristocratic rivalry. They become a political force that an aristocrat cannot simply command but must mobilize. This is not democracy born from philosophical purity. It is democracy born from crisis, calculation, and opportunity. Cleisthenes needs support against his rivals. But by appealing to the wider citizen body, he opens a door that cannot easily be closed. Once the people are invited into the centre of politics, they do not remain a temporary instrument forever. Isagoras, with Spartan help, tries to reverse the situation. Cleisthenes and many of his supporters are expelled. The old stain attached to the Alcmaeonids, the religious pollution remembered from the Solon affair, becomes a weapon against him. But the attempt to narrow power provokes resistance. The Athenian people, according to later tradition, rise against Isagoras and his Spartan backers, trapping them on the Acropolis and forcing a surrender. The details are filtered through memory, and scholars still debate how much of the account reflects later democratic pride. Yet the political meaning is clear. Athens has reached a point where the citizen body can act in defense of its own role. The Acropolis, once a Bronze Age refuge and sacred height, becomes briefly the stage for a new kind of confrontation, not merely ruler against ruler, but citizens against those who would exclude them. Cleisthenes returns, and the reforms associated with his name strike at the deep roots of aristocratic power. He does not simply add a new office or adjust a law, he reorganizes the citizen body itself. This is why his work is so radical. Earlier reforms had relieved debt, classified citizens by property, and opened certain legal pathways. Cleisthenes goes further by remaking the map of political identity. The old tribes and kinship structures, long connected to aristocratic influence, are weakened. In their place, he creates a new system based on 10 tribes, each composed of the local units called dems drawn from different regions of Attica city, coast, and inland. This sounds technical, almost administrative, but it is one of the most important acts in the history of Athens. A man's political identity is now tied more strongly to his dem, his local civic community, than to an older aristocratic lineage. His dem name becomes part of how he is identified. Local registration matters. Citizenship is anchored in a public structure rather than merely in the memory and claims of powerful families. The reform reaches into the ordinary geography of Attica and turns it into political architecture. Villages, coastal settlements, and inland communities are not just places where people live. They become building blocks of the democratic state. The 10 new tribes are deliberately mixed. Each tribe contains elements from different regions, so that old local factions cannot easily dominate politics as before. A man from the coast, a man from the city, and a man from the inland districts may now belong to the same tribe for civic and military purposes. The reform cuts across geography without erasing it. It takes the diversity of Attica and rearranges it into a new pattern of belonging. No single explanation fully accounts for the success of this system, but its brilliance lies in the way it turns division into structure. Cleisthenes does not pretend that local identities do not exist. He uses them, balances them, and binds them into a larger whole. The Council of 500 becomes one of the central institutions of this new order. 50 men from each of the 10 tribes serve, creating a broader machinery for preparing business and organizing public decision-making. The council does not replace the assembly, but it gives the democracy a working body through which the city's affairs can be managed. This matters because a large citizen body cannot govern by enthusiasm alone. It needs agendas, procedures, rotation, accountability, and a sense that ordinary citizens from across Attica can participate in the daily labour of public life. Democracy is not only the dramatic moment of voting. It is also the quieter architecture that makes voting possible. Cleisthenes' reforms also reshape military organisation. The new tribes become units through which citizens can be organised for war. This links political identity to defence in a powerful way. The citizen is not only someone who speaks or votes, he is someone whose body may be called into the service of the polis. In Athens, as in much of the ancient world, political participation and military obligation grow together. This connection is not modern equality, and it remains limited to male citizens, excluding women, enslaved people, resident foreigners, and others whose lives are deeply tied to the city, but who have no share in its political power. That exclusion must never be forgotten. Athenian democracy is radical within its citizen body and narrow beyond it. What survives in the record suggests that Cleisthenes' achievement is not a finished constitution in the modern sense, but a political refounding. He changes how Athenians locate themselves within the city. The old question of which noble family leads becomes less important than the new question of how citizens from many dems and tribes act together. The reforms do not eliminate inequality. Wealth, speech, reputation, and education still matter. Aristocrats do not vanish from public life. Many continue to dominate leadership, strategy, and persuasion, but they must now operate inside a wider civic system. They must speak to the people, seek approval, face scrutiny, and compete in institutions that no single family can fully possess. This is the deep birth of Athenian democracy, not a sudden belief that every person is equal, not a modern human rights revolution, not a peaceful philosophical awakening, but the deliberate breaking and remaking of political belonging among citizens. The city that once gathered under aristocratic display and later obeyed a tyrant now begins to distribute authority across a larger body. Attica itself is rewired. The local world becomes civic. The citizen is no longer only a dependent follower or spectator. He's registered, counted, organized, summoned, and made visible. The change must have felt both liberating and disorienting. A farmer in an inland dem, a craftsman near the city, a man living close to the coast, all now belong to a structure that reaches beyond their immediate neighbours. They are tied to men they may rarely have known before. They serve through tribes named after heroes, but those heroic names cover a new and practical design. Myth and administration blend, as they so often do in Athens. The past gives dignity to innovation. The gods and heroes remain, but the machinery beneath them is startlingly human. Athens has not yet reached its full democratic power. The assembly, courts, magistracies, and later institutions will continue to evolve, especially after war, empire, and internal crisis test them. But after Cleisthenes, the city is no longer the same kind of polis. It has learned that political identity can be engineered. It has discovered that the demos can be more than a crowd. It can be made into an institution, and once the people of Athens are placed inside the structure of power, the city begins moving toward a future in which public speech, collective judgment, and civic participation will become its most famous and most dangerous arts. With Cleisthenes' reforms, Athens becomes a city where power no longer belongs only to the old channels of birth, household, and inherited prestige. But democracy is not a feeling. It is not simply the pride of citizens who believe themselves free. It is a machinery of time, space, bodies, voices, procedures, and habits repeated so often that the city begins to trust them. The Athenians have to learn how to govern themselves in public, and that means learning where to gather, when to speak, how to vote, whom to trust, how to punish, how to remember decisions, and how to keep ambitious men from turning public confidence into private rule. The new political order does not live in theory. It lives in footsteps climbing toward meeting places, in hands raised for votes, in names scratched onto pottery, in jurors sitting through disputes, in officials chosen not because they are famous, but because the lot has fallen on them. The assembly becomes the most visible expression of citizen power. It gathers on the Pnyx, a rocky hill west of the Acropolis, where the citizens can look across toward the sacred height and the city below. This setting matters. Athenian democracy is not hidden inside a palace. It takes place under the sky, in a landscape everyone can see. The men who attend are not equal in wealth, education, confidence, or influence, but in principle they share the right to hear proposals, respond, and vote. The assembly decides questions of war, peace, alliances, laws, finances, exile, generals, and public policy. Its decisions can move ships, spend silver, condemn enemies, honour benefactors, and alter the future of thousands. A voice raised on the Pnyx can become a decree that reaches across the Aegean. Yet the assembly is not a calm school of reason. It is crowded, emotional, practical, impatient, and vulnerable to persuasion. A good speaker can shape fear into policy, pride into war, anger into punishment, caution into delay. A bad proposal can pass if it catches the mood of the moment. A wise proposal can fail if it sounds too weak, too expensive, or too late. Scholars still debate how often ordinary citizens attended, how participation varied by distance, season, occupation, and crisis, and how representative any given meeting truly was. But what survives in the record suggests that Athens creates a political culture in which public speech becomes one of the highest forms of power. The city does not merely permit persuasion, it depends on it. This gives Athens one of its most brilliant and troubling qualities. Democracy allows citizens to judge arguments, but it also rewards men who know how to move a crowd. Aristocrats still matter because wealth, education, and family reputation can train a man to speak well and be recognized. But the old elite can no longer rule without performance before the people. They must persuade. They must endure interruption, scrutiny, suspicion, and reversal. Athenian leaders are not kings. They are temporary masters of public confidence. The demos can lift them high and bring them down with frightening speed. In this city, authority is never completely secure, because every public man knows that the people who cheer today may prosecute tomorrow. Beneath the assembly stands another body essential to the working democracy, the Council of 500. Chosen from the tribes and demes, the council prepares business, supervises administration, receives envoys, manages finances, and keeps the daily life of the city from dissolving into confusion. Its members serve for limited periods, and much of its work is ordinary, repetitive, and necessary. This is where democracy becomes labor rather than drama. The famous image of Athens often focuses on great speeches and public trials, but a city cannot live by speeches alone. It needs records, schedules, inspections, religious arrangements, naval administration, building supervision, grain concerns, and constant attention to detail. The council is one of the places where ordinary citizens learn that self-government means work. The use of the lot is even more surprising to modern eyes. Many Athenian offices are filled not by election, but by random selection among eligible citizens. To Athenians, this can express a deep suspicion of entrenched power. Election tends to favour the famous, wealthy, and well-connected. The lot gives a wider range of citizens a chance to serve and prevents offices from becoming permanent possessions of ambitious men. Not every position is assigned this way. Military generals, for example, are elected because expertise and leadership in war are considered too important to leave to chance. But the broader principle is striking. Athens does not imagine democracy only as choosing leaders. It imagines democracy as distributing public responsibility among citizens. This system carries risks, and Athenians know it. Randomly chosen officials may be inexperienced. Ordinary citizens may lack specialized knowledge. Procedures can be slow. Decisions can be inconsistent. The evidence remains incomplete for many details of daily administration, and no single explanation fully accounts for how such a system functioned as effectively as it often did. But the answer seems to lie in a dense web of accountability. Officials can be examined before taking office and audited after leaving it. Public scrutiny follows public service. The city understands that giving citizens power is not enough. Power must be watched, questioned, and made temporary. In Athens, accountability is not a modern slogan, it is a survival mechanism. The courts become another vast arena of democratic power. Large citizen juries hear cases that range from private disputes to public prosecutions, with serious political consequences. These juries are not passive legal technicians. They are the people judging, and their judgment can decide property, reputation, exile, penalties, and life itself. Law in Athens is not separated cleanly from politics, morality, performance, and memory. Litigants speak before citizens who must weigh evidence. Character, probability, law, and civic emotion. The courtroom becomes another theatre of persuasion, though its stakes are often more intimate and dangerous than those of the assembly. This legal culture gives ordinary citizens extraordinary authority, but it also creates anxiety. A man in Athens can be powerful and still vulnerable to prosecution. A general who wins battles may later face trial. A politician who shapes policy may be accused of misleading the people. A private enemy may use public language to pursue personal revenge. A citizen jury can defend democracy, but it can also act harshly, emotionally, or inconsistently. Athens trusts the people and fears them. At the same time, that tension runs through the whole democratic experiment. The demos is sovereign, but sovereignty does not make the demos infallible. Ostracism reveals that tension with unusual clarity. Once a year, if the procedure is activated, citizens can vote to exile a man for 10 years without the ordinary form of criminal conviction. They scratch names onto pottery sherds, ostraca, and if enough votes are cast, the man whose name appears most often must leave. The process seems strange, almost brutal, yet its purpose is preventive. It gives the city a way to remove a dangerously powerful or divisive figure before he can become a tyrant. It is democracy remembering its fear. Athens has lived through aristocratic conflict and tyranny. It knows that brilliant men can become threats. Ostracism does not punish a crime so much as interrupt a possibility. But the same tool can serve rivalry. Citizens may ostracize someone because he is genuinely dangerous, or because his enemies have organized against him, or because the public mood turns. The procedure shows how deeply Athens worries about concentrated influence. It also shows how democracy can defend itself through exclusion. Freedom, in Athens, is never soft. It has edges. It protects the citizen body by cutting certain men away from it when fear becomes too great. The limits of this democracy are equally important. The political people of Athens are adult male citizens. Women are essential to households, religion, inheritance, and civic continuity. But they do not vote in the assembly or sit on juries. Enslaved people labour across the city and countryside, sometimes in homes, workshops, mines, and public service. Yet they have no political voice. Resident foreigners, the metics, may be wealthy, skilled, and deeply woven into Athenian life. But they remain outside citizenship. Athens invents a radical form of participation for a restricted body. That contradiction is not a footnote, it is part of the structure. The freedom of the citizen exists within a wider world of exclusion and dependency. Still, inside that citizen body, the transformation is astonishing. A farmer from a distant dem, a potter, a sailor, a modest landholder, a man without noble blood can become part of the city's decision-making life. He may serve on the council. He may sit as a juror. He may vote in the assembly. He may hold an office by lot. He may judge men richer and more famous than himself. He may hear envoys from foreign states and decide whether Athens goes to war. The experience changes what it means to be Athenian. Citizenship becomes not merely a status inherited from one's father, but a practice repeated in public. Athens therefore becomes a city of restless attention. Citizens watch officials, speakers, generals, allies, enemies, neighbours, and one another. They learn procedures as part of civic life. They become accustomed to the idea that public matters are not the private property of rulers. This does not make them always wise, always just, or always moderate. It makes them responsible in a way few ancient communities had attempted at such scale. The city has broken the old tribes, survived tyranny, and built institutions that draw citizens into the work of power. The experiment is alive now, breathing in the assembly, arguing in the courts, rotating through the council, and scratching names onto shards of broken pottery. Athens has discovered that democracy is not only a promise of freedom, it is a demanding, unstable, human system for deciding what freedom will cost. The machinery of democracy is still young when a larger shadow begins to stretch across the Aegean. Athens has learned to gather citizens, rotate offices, hear lawsuits, and fear the return of tyranny. But the city has not yet learned what it means to stand against an empire. To the east, the Persian Empire rules on a scale that no Greek polis can match. It is vast, wealthy, administratively sophisticated, and capable of drawing soldiers, ships, tribute, and officials from lands that seem almost impossibly distant to a small community in Attica. Against such a power, Athens is not a natural giant. It is a restless city with a hard landscape, a new democracy, internal memories of faction, and a growing confidence that may look, from the outside, like dangerous arrogance. The first link in the chain is not simply Persian aggression toward Athens. It begins in the Ionian Greek cities of Asia Minor, communities tied by language and culture to the Greek world but living under Persian rule. When revolt breaks out there in the early 5th century BCE, Athens and Eretria send help, a decision that seems bold in the moment and reckless in hindsight. The revolt fails. Persia does not forget. In the logic of empire, a distant city that interferes in imperial territory must be corrected. Athens has entered a wider political world, and the wider world now turns its gaze back toward Athens. The Persian expedition that arrives in 490 BCE is not just an army. It is a message. It brings with it the exiled tyrant Hippias, the former ruler of Athens, who hopes to return under Persian protection. For the Athenians, this makes the threat intimate. Persia is not only foreign conquest, it is the possible restoration of tyranny, the fear that shaped ostracism, the memory that justified reforms. The anxiety that one man might again dominate the city, all of it gathers suddenly on the plain of Marathon. The democracy is still young enough that its future can be imagined ending there, not in a slow decline, but in a single defeat. Marathon lies northeast of Athens, a broad plain between hills and sea. The Athenians march out to meet the Persian force, joined by the small city of Plataea, whose loyalty will later be remembered with gratitude. Sparta is asked for help but does not arrive in time, constrained, according to tradition, by religious timing. Scholars still debate the numbers involved, and ancient figures are often treated with caution, but the imbalance in scale becomes part of the memory. The Athenians face an imperial army without the full weight of the Greek world beside them. What survives in the record suggests that the battle becomes not only military but psychological. If they lose, Athens may fall. If they win, the new democracy will have passed through fire. The victory at Marathon becomes one of the great founding memories of classical Athens. Later generations will return to it again and again, sometimes with pride, sometimes with exaggeration, sometimes with political purpose. It proves, or seems to prove, that citizen soldiers defending their own land can defeat the forces of a king. The hoplite line, the discipline of men standing shield to shield, becomes more than tactics. It becomes an image of civic courage. The men who fight at Marathon are not subjects serving a monarch. They are citizens defending a city whose institutions they share. That distinction matters enormously to Athenian memory, even if modern historians must keep the event grounded and avoid turning it into myth alone. Still, Marathon does not end the danger. It gives Athens time. The Persian Empire remains vast. A defeat on one plain does not erase imperial power. Inside Athens, the question becomes what kind of city survival now requires. Some may look back toward the old hoplite ideal, the land-holding citizen in armour defending Attica. But another vision begins to rise, tied to the sea, the harbours, and the silver mines of Laurion, Themistocles, one of the most consequential and controversial figures in Athenian history, understands that the next Persian attack may not be stopped by hoplites alone. Athens must become a naval power. This is a turning point not only in military history but in democratic history. Building a fleet requires money, organisation, timber, shipyards, trained crews, and strategic imagination. It also requires rowers, the trireme, the fast warship that becomes central to Athenian power, depends on coordinated human labour. Many of the rowers come from the poorer citizen class, the thetes, men who cannot afford the equipment of a hoplite but can pull an oar in the service of the city. When Athens chooses the fleet, it does more than prepare for war. It increases the importance of poorer citizens to the survival of the polis. Naval power and democratic power begin to reinforce one another. The decision to use the wealth from Laurion silver for ships rather than distributing it more immediately is one of those moments where policy alters destiny. Themistocles persuades Athens to think beyond short-term gain. The evidence remains shaped by later admiration and hostility toward him, and no single explanation fully accounts for why his vision prevails, but the result is unmistakable. Athens builds the fleet that will soon become its shield. It also begins to orient its future toward Piraeus, the harbour that will become the city's maritime heart. The old land of thin soil and hard farming is now turning decisively toward the sea. When Xerxes, king of Persia, launches the great invasion of 480 BCE, the scale of the threat dwarfs the earlier campaign. Greek memory will make the Persian host immense, almost beyond counting, though modern scholars treat ancient numbers with care. What matters is not the exact figure, but the sense of overwhelming force. Cities must choose submission, resistance, or calculation. The Greek world is divided. Some fight, some hesitate, some cooperate with Persia. Athens evacuates its people. A traumatic decision that reveals the cold logic of strategy. The city can be abandoned if the fleet survives. Stone and houses may burn. The civic body must endure. The Persians take Athens and destroy sacred places on the Acropolis. For later Athenians, this becomes a wound carved into religious memory. The high rock that once symbolized protection is violated. Temples and dedications are damaged. The city itself seems lost. Yet Athens is not finished, because the people, the ships, and the decision-making body have not disappeared. This is one of the most striking lessons of the crisis. The polis is not only its buildings, it is its citizens, gods, laws, memory, and capacity to act together. Athens can burn and still remain Athens if the civic body survives. At Salamis, in the narrow waters near Attica, the Athenian fleet and its Greek allies confront the Persian navy. Themistocles' strategy, remembered through layers of later storytelling, draws Persian ships into confined waters where numbers become less useful. The Greek victory changes the war. It does not end every danger at once, but it breaks the momentum of invasion and gives the resisting Greeks a path toward final success. For Athens, Salamis becomes as important as Marathon, perhaps even more so. Marathon honours the hoplite citizen on land. Salamis honours the naval citizen at sea. Together they reshape the political imagination of the city. After the Persian Wars, Athens is no longer simply a daring polis with a new democracy. It is the city whose fleet helped save Greece. That memory gives it prestige, confidence, and a dangerous sense of mission. The poorer rowers who powered the ships cannot easily be dismissed afterward. The sea becomes not only a road for trade, but the foundation of power. The democracy that has been built in the reforms of Cleisthenes now has a naval body beneath it. Citizens who pull oars can claim that they, too, carry the city on their backs. But victory carries a hidden cost. The fleet that saves Athens can also dominate others. The harbours that preserve freedom can become instruments of empire. The confidence born at Marathon and Salamis can harden into ambition. Athens survives Persia, but survival transforms it. The city that once feared the return of tyranny now possesses the tools to project power across the Aegean. Its democracy has passed its greatest early test, and in passing it, has become stronger, broader, and more dangerous than before. Victory over Persia leaves Athens standing in the sunlight of its own astonishment. The city has been burned, its sanctuaries scarred, its people displaced, and yet it has not merely survived. It has emerged with a fleet, a reputation, and a story powerful enough to change the balance of the Greek world. Marathon proves that Athenians can defend their land. Salamis proves that their ships can help decide the fate of cities. In the years after the Persian Wars, the democracy does not shrink back into a modest local experiment. It begins to look outward with a new confidence, and that confidence soon takes institutional form in an alliance that will become one of the most uncomfortable truths in Athenian history. The city remembered as a birthplace of freedom also becomes an imperial power. At first, the transformation does not present itself as empire. It begins as security. Persia remains a threat. The Greek cities of the Aegean and Asia Minor need protection. The islands and coastal communities that have suffered under or near Persian power look for leadership. Sparta, formidable on land but cautious and less suited to long-distance naval command, does not hold the maritime alliance together. Athens, with its fleet and its new prestige, steps into that role. The Delian League takes its name from the sacred island of Delos, where the alliance treasury is first kept under the protection of Apollo. In principle, this is a voluntary coalition of Greek states committed to continuing the struggle against Persia. Members contribute ships or money. Athens leads. The language is liberation, defense, and common cause. But alliances have a way of changing when one member controls the strongest navy. Over time, many allies stop providing ships and instead pay tribute. That may seem practical. Money is easier than maintaining fleets, but the shift matters enormously. Once Athens supplies the ships and the allies supply the money, the balance of power tilts. The allies become less capable of independent defense, while Athens becomes more capable of command. Tribute flows into Athenian-managed systems. A league of partners slowly becomes a structure of dependency. The evidence remains incomplete in places, and scholars still debate the pace, motives, and local experiences of this transformation. But the broad direction is clear. Athens begins as leader of an anti-Persian coalition and becomes master of an Aegean empire. This imperial turn is not hidden from the material record. Tribute lists, inscriptions, harbour installations, ship sheds, decrees, coinage, and the growing scale of Athenian public life all reflect a city drawing resources from beyond Attica. The empire is not an abstract idea. It is measured, recorded, transported, stored, argued over, and spent. Silver arrives. Grain routes are protected. Garrisons and clerishes extend influence. Rebellious allies face punishment. Aegean islands and coastal cities learn that Athenian friendship is not always easily distinguished from Athenian control. The same democracy that gives citizens a voice in Athens can deny meaningful autonomy to allied communities beyond it. This is one of the central contradictions of the classical city, and no honest telling of Athens can avoid it. For Athenian citizens, however, empire can feel like strength, security, and opportunity. Tribute helps fund the fleet that protects trade and grain supply. Naval power gives poorer citizens continued importance as rowers. Public pay for service in courts and offices, especially as it develops across the 5th century, allows broader participation by citizens who cannot afford to spend days away from work without compensation. Building programs employ craftsmen, labourers, sculptors, quarrymen, metalworkers, carpenters, painters, and transporters. The democracy becomes more participatory, partly because imperial income and maritime power support the conditions that make participation possible. Freedom at home is intertwined with domination abroad. That fact does not make Athenian democracy false, but it makes it morally and historically complicated. The long walls embody this new Athens in stone. These walls connect the city to its harbour at Piraeus, turning Athens and its port into a fortified system. If Attica is invaded, the rural land may suffer, but the city can remain linked to the sea. The fleet can operate. Grain can arrive. The population can retreat behind walls. The strategy is bold and deeply revealing. Old Greek warfare often centres on defending fields, meeting the enemy in hoplite battle, and protecting the agricultural base of the community. Athens increasingly builds a different kind of power. It is willing to sacrifice the countryside temporarily if the city, harbour, and fleet survive. Its true lifeline is no longer only the soil of Attica, it is the sea. Piraeus becomes the physical expression of this maritime future, planned with broad attention to harbours, naval facilities, trade, and urban order. It is not merely a place where ships happen to land. It becomes a second heart of Athens, lower than the Acropolis, closer to salt water, filled with sailors, merchants, foreigners, shipwrights, dock workers, cargo, noise, and opportunity. The city above and the harbour below depend on one another. Athens without Piraeus would still have memory, temples, and citizens. Athens with Piraeus has reach. It can touch islands, threaten enemies, import grain, export pottery and oil, and receive ideas from every direction. The democracy speaks on the Nix, but much of its power is pulled by oars from the harbour. This new world changes social imagination. The poorest citizens, once politically marginal, now know that the city's survival depends on their bodies in the fleet. The trireme is a discipline machine made of wood, bronze, rope, and human coordination. Its power comes from rhythm. Rowers must move together, obey commands, endure exhaustion, and trust that the ship's speed may decide whether they live, win, or drown. A hoplite can imagine himself standing in a line of property-bearing men defending ancestral land. A rower can imagine himself as part of something more fluid, urban, naval, and democratic. The empire strengthens this identity. Athens's lower-class citizens are not spectators to power, they help propel it. At the same time, the empire feeds the ambitions of elite leaders. Men with education, reputation, wealth, and rhetorical skill compete to guide the democracy's decisions. They do not rule as kings, but they influence policy through persuasion. The people decide. Yet decisions are often shaped by those who can frame danger, honour, profit, and necessity in compelling words. This is where freedom and leadership become difficult to separate. The assembly is sovereign, but it must hear from speakers. The city distrusts concentrated power, but it repeatedly elevates powerful personalities. Athens tries to prevent tyranny, yet it depends on men who can move the public mind. Pericles stands at the centre of this imperial democracy. He is not a tyrant, though his influence becomes so great that later observers struggle to describe it without paradox. He wins trust through strategy, aristocratic presence, public speech, and a vision of Athens as a city worthy of exceptional greatness. Under his leadership, Athens becomes more confident in its democracy, more ambitious in its building, more commanding in its empire, and more conscious of its own image. Yet Pericles does not create this world alone. He rides forces already in motion: the fleet, tribute, public pay, civic pride, rivalry with Sparta, and the memory of Persian destruction. His genius lies partly in understanding what Athens wants to believe about itself and giving that belief monumental form. The transfer of the League treasury from Delos to Athens becomes a symbol of the changing order. Defenders can argue that Athens bears the burden of defence and therefore must control resources efficiently. Critics, ancient and modern, can see something else: the sacred centre of a common alliance being absorbed into the leading city's power. The tribute of allies helps fund projects that glorify Athens. The Parthenon and other buildings of the Acropolis are not paid for by Attic pride alone. They rise in a world where imperial wealth and democratic ambition meet. The result is astonishing beauty. But beauty does not erase the political reality beneath it. Marble can glow in the sun while carrying the shadow of tribute. Allied cities that attempt to leave the Athenian orbit learn how limited their freedom has become. Revolts are suppressed, settlements are imposed, courts and decrees extend Athenian authority. The empire may protect some communities from Persia and piracy, stabilize trade, and connect the Aegean, but it also narrows the political life of its members. Athens asks of others what it would fiercely resist for its self-obedience to an external power. That contradiction is not accidental. It is structural. The democracy defines freedom intensely for its citizens, but that citizen body benefits from a system in which others have less freedom. And yet, the story cannot be flattened into hypocrisy alone. Ancient power rarely divides neatly into virtue and crime. Athens is not unique in seeking dominance. Greek cities compete constantly, and Sparta's own order rests on coercion of a different and severe kind. The Persian Empire itself is no small neutral presence. The Aegean world is dangerous, and small states often choose between larger powers rather than pure independence. What makes Athens so compelling is not that it alone is morally compromised, but that its ideals are so bright and its compromises so visible. It gives the world a language of citizen freedom while building an empire that tests the meaning of that language. By the middle of the 5th century BCE, Athens has become something unprecedented in Greek history: a radical democracy at home, a naval empire abroad, a cultural magnet, a military power, a sacred city rebuilding from destruction, and a restless political experiment held together by walls, ships, tribute, argument, and pride. The Acropolis rises above it, still wounded in memory by Persian fire, but soon to be remade in marble. The agora below grows busier, more administrative, more legal, more public. Piraeus roars with maritime life. The assembly debates not only local affairs, but the fate of allies and enemies scattered across the sea. Athens has become larger than Attica, and that enlargement brings glory, wealth, danger, and a new kind of moral pressure. the city that once fought to keep a tyrant from returning now must ask, even if it rarely wants to hear the answer, whether a democracy can rule others without becoming something like what it fears. The empire gives Athens reach, but the city's ambition does not remain at sea. It turns upward, toward the scarred rock of the Acropolis, and outward into theatres, festivals, painted stoas, statues, altars, law courts, and public spaces where Athenians learn to see themselves as a people unlike any other. After the Persian destruction, the Acropolis is not merely a place to rebuild, it is a wound that can be transformed into a statement. The ruins of the older temples and offerings remind the city of invasion, humiliation, and survival. To build there again is not only an act of piety, it is an act of memory and power. Athens will not simply repair what Persia damaged. It will make the sacred height proclaim that the city has risen stronger than the fire meant to erase it. The building program associated with Pericles is one of the most famous acts of civic self-fashioning in the ancient world. The Parthenon, the Propylaea, the Temple of Athena Nike, and later the Erechtheion do not appear as isolated monuments. They belong to a larger transformation of the Acropolis into a sacred and political landscape of extraordinary precision. Marble from Pentelicus is quarried, transported, cut, lifted, joined, carved, and polished into forms that seem effortless, only because so much labour has disappeared behind beauty. Architects, sculptors, stonecutters, metalworkers, painters, carpenters, haulers, and countless supporting workers participate in turning imperial wealth and civic pride into visible permanence. The evidence remains incomplete in many practical details, but the surviving accounts and the stones themselves reveal a city capable of organizing art on a public scale rarely matched in antiquity. The Parthenon is often treated as a symbol of democracy, but that is only part of the truth. It is also a temple, a treasury, a victory monument, an imperial statement, and a work of astonishing visual intelligence. Its columns lean and swell subtly. Its lines correct the eye rather than obey simple geometry. Its sculptural program places myth, gods, civic procession, cosmic order, and martial triumph into one marble language. The building does not say one thing, it says many things at once. It honours Athena. It remembers victory over Persia. It displays the wealth and discipline of Athens. It implies that the city stands close to divine favour. It presents civic life as something worthy of monumental form. What survives in the record suggests that Athenians did not sharply separate religion, politics, and art in the way modern viewers often do. On the Acropolis, they are fused. Yet the beauty of these monuments is inseparable from controversy. The resources of empire help pay for the glory of Athens. Allies who contribute tribute to a league once dedicated to common defence can see their wealth transformed into marble above a city that increasingly commands them. Ancient critics notice the problem, and modern historians continue to debate how Athenians justified such spending to themselves. Pericles could present the projects as employment, honour to the gods, repayment for suffering, and a public expression of greatness. But no single explanation fully accounts for the moral tension. The Acropolis is both sacred art and imperial display. Its stones glow with devotion and domination at the same time. Below the Acropolis, another kind of Athenian brilliance takes shape, less permanent than marble but perhaps even more revealing. In the theatre of Dionysus, citizens gather for tragedy and comedy during major festivals. These are not private entertainments in the modern sense. They are civic events, religious offerings, competitions, public reflections, and emotional tests. The city sits together and watches stories of kings, heroes, gods, families, cities, strangers, victors, and victims. The plots may be set in mythic time, far from contemporary Athens, yet their pressure falls directly on the audience. War, pride, justice, grief, law, revenge, divine will, persuasion, and civic responsibility are placed before citizens who themselves must judge war, law, and public policy in real life. Tragedy teaches Athens without flattering it. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides do not give the city simple lessons. They show worlds where every choice carries damage, where noble intentions collide with divine uncertainty, where victory can breed pollution, and where human wisdom arrives too late. In a democracy that trusts debate and judgment, tragedy reminds citizens that judgment is difficult. It shows the danger of certainty. It asks the audience to sit with suffering that cannot be solved by a quick vote. Scholars still debate the precise political function of tragedy, and it would be too simple to call the theatre propaganda for democracy. It is more unsettling than that. It is one of the places where Athens examines the cost of being human while pretending, only partly, that the stories belong to someone else. Comedy is sharper and less reverent. Old comedy, especially in the work of Aristophanes, turns the city's leaders, habits, wars, philosophers, jurors, poets, and obsessions into public laughter. It can be obscene, fantastical, cruel, brilliant, and politically revealing. A democracy must tolerate speech that bites, or else its freedom is thinner than it claims. A comic poet can mock powerful men before thousands. He can twist public policy into absurdity, make fun of intellectual fashion, and expose the vanity of citizens who believe themselves wise. Comedy does not make Athens gentle. It makes Athens audible in another register, noisy, self-conscious, argumentative, and unwilling to leave even its own greatness untouched. The festivals that frame drama also bind the city to its gods and to itself. The Panathenaic procession moves through Athens toward the Acropolis, carrying the community into sacred visibility, citizens, metics, women in ritual roles, officials, musicians, animals for sacrifice, and representatives of civic order appear in motion. The city becomes a procession before it becomes an argument. On the Parthenon frieze, many have seen an idealized reflection of such civic ritual. Though interpretation remains debated, what matters for the story of Athens is the link between movement, memory, and identity. The people do not merely inhabit the city, they perform it. The agora, too, becomes a dense theatre of civic life. It is not only a marketplace, though trade matters. It is where law, administration, religion, memory, and daily conversation meet. Stoas offer shade and space for talk. Monuments remind citizens of victories, benefactors, laws, heroes, and dangers. Public buildings house officials and records. Altars and shrines make the gods present in ordinary movement. A man can come to buy food, hear gossip, see a decree, encounter a magistrate, watch a procession, or find himself drawn into political conversation. Philosophy will soon find a natural home in such a place because the agora is already a landscape of encounter. Athens thinks in public partly because it lives in public. Art in Athens does not float above politics. Sculpture, painting, architecture, drama, and ritual all participate in the city's self-understanding. They make visible the ideals Athenians claim, the fears they conceal, and the contradictions they live with. The Acropolis says Athens is favoured, ordered, victorious, and beautiful. The theatre says human life is uncertain, pride is dangerous, and public judgment can be tragic. Comedy says no citizen, general, poet, or thinker is safe from laughter. The agora says power must be seen, recorded, argued, and remembered among the people. Together, these spaces create a city that teaches itself through spectacle and debate. This is why classical Athens feels so alive even in ruins. Its monuments are not silent achievements of taste, they are arguments in stone. Its plays are not relics of literary history, they are civic experiences shaped by a society that gives words dangerous force. Its festivals are not picturesque ceremonies, they are ways of turning scattered citizens into a visible body. The city has become a place where beauty, religion, empire, democracy, and anxiety meet daily under the same bright sky. It builds as though marble might outlast doubt. It stages tragedies as though doubt might save it from arrogance. It laughs as though laughter itself is a form of freedom. And beneath all of it, Athens continues to ask, with increasing urgency, whether a people clever enough to create such wonders is wise enough to govern the power those wonders proclaim. In a city where citizens argue over laws, generals, tribute, comedy, building programs, lawsuits, and war, it is almost inevitable that thought itself begins to become public. Athens does not invent intelligence, and it does not own philosophy in any simple way. Greek inquiry has older and wider roots, reaching across Ionia, southern Italy, Sicily, and other parts of the Mediterranean where thinkers speculate about nature, change, number, matter, gods, justice, and the hidden order of things. But Athens gives thought a particular stage. It gives inquiry a noisy civic world in which arguments are not sealed inside temples or palaces. They move through houses, workshops, gymnasia, courts, schools, dinner parties, and above all through the open spaces of a city addicted to speech. The same culture that teaches citizens to judge public proposals also teaches them to ask what judgment itself is worth. The agora becomes one of the great landscapes of this restless mind. It is not a university, it is messier, more alive, more dangerous. Men pass through it on business, politics, religion, trade, and curiosity. They hear rumours from the harbour, news from allied cities, complaints about taxes, jokes from comic poets, legal strategies, foreign accents, and fragments of argument. A bronze worker, a wealthy youth, a visiting intellectual, a politician, a juror, and a philosopher may all move through the same public air. No single explanation fully accounts for why Athens becomes so fertile for intellectual life, but its democracy matters. Where persuasion is power, thinking about persuasion becomes urgent. Where ordinary citizens judge cases, questions about justice become practical. Where public speech can raise or ruin a man, language itself becomes a weapon worth studying. Into this world come the sophists, travelling teachers whose reputation has never stopped causing argument. They are often remembered through the hostile eyes of critics, especially later philosophers who accuse them of selling cleverness without truth. But that picture is incomplete. The sophists answer a real need in democratic Athens. Young men who hope to succeed in politics or law must learn to speak well, reason sharply, interpret tradition, and make weaker positions appear stronger when necessary. In a city of courts and assemblies, rhetoric is not ornamental, it is survival. The sophists teach grammar, argument, ethics, politics, memory, and public performance. Some are foreigners, which makes their presence even more revealing. Athens, proud of its citizenship, still draws intellectual energy from outsiders who bring different habits of thought into the city. Their teaching unsettles older certainties. If persuasion can be taught, then noble birth is not the only road to influence. If laws differ from city to city, then perhaps justice is not simply identical with ancestral custom. If human beings create political arrangements, then perhaps those arrangements can be examined, defended, or changed. The evidence remains incomplete for the exact teachings of many sophists, because much survives through fragments or hostile reports. Yet the questions associated with them are unmistakable. What is nature, and what is convention? Is law sacred, or human? Is virtue teachable? Does success in public life require truth, or only effective speech? These are not harmless puzzles in Athens. They cut into the foundations of civic life. Socrates moves through this same world, but he does not fit neatly inside it. He writes nothing, holds no formal office of philosophical authority, founds no school in the later institutional sense, and leaves behind no text in his own hand. What survives comes through others, especially Plato and Xenophon, and through the comic distortions of Aristophanes. Scholars still debate how to separate the historical Socrates from the literary Socrates created by those who remembered, loved, mocked, or used him. Yet even through that uncertainty, a compelling figure appears, a man who turns inquiry away from the distant structure of the cosmos and toward the human soul, the meaning of virtue, the nature of justice, and the dangerous gap between confidence and knowledge. He is not impressive in the way Athens usually measures public men. He is not a polished statesman seeking office. He is not a general famous for conquest, though he serves as a soldier and is remembered for endurance. He is not rich. He does not flatter the democracy, yet he does not simply flee it. He lives inside the city's speech world and makes that world uncomfortable. He asks men what they mean when they claim to know courage, piety, justice, moderation, or wisdom. He does not merely argue to win. He exposes the uncertainty beneath respectable answers. In a city proud of public judgment, Socrates becomes a living reminder that citizens may judge constantly without fully understanding the standards by which they judge. This is both magnificent and irritating. Athens has room for argument, but not infinite patience for humiliation. A man who questions everyone can appear wise to some and dangerous to others. He disrupts the smooth surface of civic confidence. He suggests that public success, reputation, and majority approval may not equal truth. He makes powerful men look foolish, and perhaps even worse. He attracts young followers from influential families. In a city already anxious about elite ambition, war, empire, and moral change, that matters. Philosophy is not floating above politics. It is walking through the streets, asking questions that make fathers suspicious, politicians defensive, and comic poets delighted. Natural inquiry also circulates in Athens, though the city's most famous philosophical turn is ethical and political. Thinkers associated with earlier traditions had asked what the world is made of, how change occurs, whether all things arise from water, air, number, atoms, or some deeper principle. By the 5th century, Athens is aware of these intellectual currents. Anaxagoras, linked with Pericles in later tradition, brings bold speculation about the heavens and mind. Such thinking can be dangerous because it touches religion. To explain celestial phenomena naturally may sound, to some ears, like dishonoring the gods. The boundary between inquiry and impiety is not stable. a city can celebrate intelligence and still fear that intelligence will dissolve reverence. This tension runs through the whole Athenian intellectual world. Democracy needs skilled speech, but fears manipulation. Religion anchors the city, but inquiry asks what lies behind appearances. Tradition gives identity, but comparison with other cities reveals that customs differ. Empire expands horizons, but also exposes Athens to criticism and moral strain. The theatre questions heroic values. Comedy mocks philosophers as cloud-gazing frauds. Courts demand arguments about law and probability. The assembly asks citizens to decide under pressure. Philosophy grows not because Athens is peaceful, but because Athens is overfull of competing claims about how life should be lived. The lesser-known truth is that many Athenians may not have experienced this intellectual ferment as a golden age of thought. For some, it feels like confusion. Old certainties weaken. Young men learn to argue against their elders. Teachers charge fees for verbal skill. Public speakers can make injustice sound necessary. Philosophers seem to ask questions without offering usable answers. The democracy depends on persuasion, yet grows suspicious of those who master persuasion too well. The same city that opens space for inquiry also develops legal and social tools to punish forms of thought it considers corrosive. Athens is free, but its freedom is nervous. And still, something extraordinary happens. Thought becomes a civic drama. Ideas are tested not only in quiet contemplation, but in the friction of public life. Ethics becomes urgent because decisions have consequences. Politics becomes philosophical because citizens must ask what justice means when power belongs to many. Rhetoric becomes suspect because speech can guide or corrupt the people. Education becomes a battlefield because the future of the city depends on what its young men learn to admire. Socrates, the sophists, natural philosophers, tragedians, comic poets, and public speakers all inhabit the same charged atmosphere, each revealing a different face of Athens' deepest experiment. By the late 5th century BCE, Athens has become a city that questions almost everything except, perhaps, its own ability to survive questioning. Its democracy gives speech power, and speech gives birth to new forms of doubt. Its empire gives it wealth, and wealth gives it leisure and arrogance. Its theatres teach complexity. Its courts reward argument. Its agora multiplies encounters. And its philosophers ask whether a life without examination is worthy of human dignity. The city has built temples that make confidence visible in marble, but in the streets below, a barefoot questioner and a generation of teachers make confidence tremble. Athens is no longer only governing itself, it is interrogating itself, and that habit, once awakened, will prove as dangerous as any army beyond the walls. The questions rising in Athens do not remain safely inside schools, theatres, and conversations in the agora. They move into a world increasingly shaped by fear, rivalry, and war. By the middle of the 5th century BCE, Athens has become too powerful for other Greek states to ignore and too ambitious to seem harmless. Its fleet dominates the sea. Its walls bind city and harbour into a fortified machine. Its tribute system reaches across the Aegean. Its democracy gives poorer citizens a reason to support naval expansion, while its leaders speak of honour, security, and necessity with growing confidence. To many Athenians, the empire is the shield that protects freedom. To many outside Athens, it looks like a cage built from ships. Sparta watches from the Peloponnese with a different kind of power. It is not a maritime democracy, not a city of theatre and argument in the Athenian style, not a place that celebrates restless innovation. Sparta is land-based, disciplined, oligarchic, conservative, and feared for its army. Its society rests on a severe internal order and the domination of a large unfree population, a reality that gives Spartan courage its own dark foundation. Athens and Sparta are not simple opposites, but they become symbols of opposing worlds. One looks to the sea, speech, walls, tribute, and citizen assembly. The other looks to land, discipline, hierarchy, and military endurance. Between them lies a Greek world too crowded with alliances, suspicions, and old grievances to remain balanced forever. The Peloponnesian War begins not as a single clean explosion, but as a chain of disputes, fears, calculations, and provocations. Corcyra, Corinth, Potidaea, Megara, and other places become part of a widening crisis in which local conflicts draw great powers closer to confrontation. Thucydides, the Athenian historian who gives the war its most powerful ancient analysis, famously sees the deeper cause in the growth of Athenian power and the fear this creates in Sparta. Modern scholars still debate the relative weight of immediate triggers, economic pressures, alliance obligations, and ideological rivalry, but the broad danger is clear. Athens has become strong enough that even peace begins to feel unstable. Pericles' strategy at the beginning of the war is cold, disciplined, and deeply connected to the maritime identity Athens has built. He does not want Athenians to march out and risk everything in a pitched land battle against the Spartan army. Instead, he urges them to withdraw behind the long walls, protect the city and harbour, rely on the fleet, raid the Peloponnesian coast, and endure. Attica's farms may be ravaged, but Athens can survive through the sea. It is a strategy that treats the countryside as painful but expendable, and the city-harbour fleet system as the true body of power. It makes sense on paper. It also asks human beings to watch their land burn while they crowd behind walls and trust strategy more than instinct. That crowding brings catastrophe. A plague breaks out in Athens early in the war, moving through the packed population with terrifying force. Thucydides, who says he suffered from it himself, describes its physical and social effects with a clarity that still unsettles readers. Modern scholars have proposed different identifications for the disease, and no single explanation has won universal agreement. Typhus, typhoid fever, smallpox, measles, Ebola-like illness, and other possibilities have all been discussed, though the evidence remains incomplete. What matters historically is not only the pathogen's name, but the way disease enters the political life of the city. Athens has built walls to protect itself from soldiers, only to discover that walls can also trap suffering inside. The plague does not simply kill, it weakens confidence, it strains rituals, it disrupts households, it makes ordinary civic order feel fragile. People who had believed in the city's exceptional destiny now see strategy fail before an enemy no hoplite can meet and no trireme can ram. Pericles himself dies during the epidemic, and with him Athens loses the leader most associated with restraint, long-term planning, and the ability to hold public trust. Later memory sometimes imagines the city declining after him into more reckless leadership, and that picture can be too neat. Athens remains capable, creative, and formidable. But the loss is real. The democracy now has to navigate war without the man who had most successfully shaped its imperial confidence. The war drags on in phases, shifting across land and sea, alliances and revolts, truces and renewed violence. Athens shows resilience. It survives invasion, plague, financial strain, and allied unrest. its fleet remains dangerous. Its citizens continue to debate, judge, build, perform, and govern under pressure. Yet the pressures change the tone of political life. Fear hardens. Anger becomes easier to mobilize. Suspicion deepens. The question of how to treat rebellious allies becomes especially revealing. When Mytilene revolts from the Athenian Empire, the assembly first votes for a severe punishment, then reconsiders the next day and sends a second ship racing after the first to reverse the decision before it is carried out. The episode, as remembered by Thucydides, shows democracy at its most alarming and most self-correcting. The people can act in fury, but they can also reopen judgment. Freedom does not guarantee wisdom, yet it allows second thoughts to become public action. Still, not every second thought arrives in time. The war coarsens the moral imagination of the Greek world. Civil conflicts inside allied cities grow savage. Words change their meanings under the pressure of faction, as courage becomes recklessness, caution becomes cowardice, moderation becomes weakness, and loyalty becomes obedience to party. Athens is not alone in this decline of restraint. The war spreads corruption through many communities, but Athens, because it is claimed so much for public reason and civic judgment, becomes a particularly dramatic stage for the failure of both. The city that teaches itself through tragedy now seems to be living one. The greatest act of overreach comes with the Sicilian expedition. Athens turns its eyes westward towards Sicily, especially Syracuse, imagining strategic advantage, wealth, glory, and expanded influence. Their plan is enormous, distant, and filled with uncertainty. Nicias warns against it, but his warnings are transformed into arguments for sending even greater resources. Alcibiades, brilliant, charming, ambitious, and dangerous, embodies the seductive energy of imperial Athens at its most unstable. He can inspire confidence and suspicion in almost equal measure. The mutilation of the Herms and accusations of religious scandal poison the atmosphere before the expedition even properly unfolds, and Alcibiades is recalled to stand trial, only to flee and eventually advise Athens's enemies. Few lives show more vividly how Athenian brilliance can become self-destructive. The Sicilian campaign becomes a disaster of almost unimaginable scale for Athens. The fleet and army are trapped far from home. Command falters. Reinforcements arrive too late to change the deeper reality. Syracuse resists. The Athenians suffer defeat by land and sea. The final retreat collapses into surrender, death, imprisonment, and the destruction of a force that Athens can scarcely afford to lose. Ancient accounts describe the shock with a gravity that still carries across time. For Athens, Sicily is more than a failed campaign. It is a wound to the city's belief in its own judgment. The assembly had approved the expedition. Leaders had persuaded. Citizens had cheered. The machinery of democracy had functioned, and the result was catastrophe. After Sicily, Athens continues to fight with astonishing stubbornness. That resilience should not be underestimated. Many cities would have collapsed sooner. Athens rebuilds fleets, shifts strategies, recalls leaders, and searches desperately for advantage. But the war has changed. The empire is shakier. Persia begins to re-enter Greek affairs by supporting Sparta financially. Spartan naval capacity grows. Internal political tension in Athens worsens, and oligarchic conspirators argue that democracy has led the city toward ruin. In 411 BCE, amid military crisis and fear, an oligarchic coup briefly replaces the democracy with narrower regimes. The old question returns in a harsher form: can the people be trusted with power when the city is in danger? The democracy is restored, but the wound remains. Athens continues until its final defeat in 404 BCE, when starvation, blockade, and exhaustion bring the city to surrender. The long walls are torn down, the fleet is reduced, the empire is lost. A Spartan-backed oligarchy, later remembered as the 30, imposes terror on the city before democracy returns again. The war that began as a contest between powers ends by exposing the fragility of every Athenian achievement empire: confidence. Public speech, civic trust, and the belief that intelligence can master events. The city survives, but not unchanged. Its democracy has been tested by plague, fear, demagogues, overreach, betrayal, oligarchy, and defeat. It has produced courage and cruelty, second thoughts and disastrous enthusiasms. Athens remains alive, but the golden certainty is gone. Under the same sky where citizens once imagined their city almost favoured beyond measure, they now face the harder knowledge that freedom can make mistakes at full public volume, and that even the most brilliant city can become lost inside the power it learns to love. After defeat, Athens is not silent. That may be the most astonishing thing about the city. Its walls have been torn down, its empire stripped away, its fleet reduced, its confidence humiliated, and its democracy wounded by oligarchic violence. Yet the city continues to argue. The agora still fills with movement. The courts still hear disputes. Citizens still remember, accuse, defend, rebuild, and reinterpret what has happened to them. Athens has lost command of the Aegean. But it has not lost the habit that made it Athens the need to examine public life through speech. Yet after the Peloponnesian War, that habit carries a sharper edge. Words no longer feel merely creative, they feel dangerous. The city has seen persuasion lead to empire, disaster, coups, executions, exile, restoration, and revenge. In that atmosphere, a man who has spent decades asking uncomfortable questions becomes impossible to separate from the wounds of the age. Socrates is already old when he is brought to trial in 399 BCE. He has lived through the height of Periclean Athens, the plague, the long war, the Sicilian disaster, the oligarchic coup of 411, the final defeat, the rule of the 30, and the restoration of democracy. He has watched the city rise into greatness and nearly destroy itself. He has never been simply a private thinker. He is a public presence, a man known in the streets and gymnasia, associated with questioning irony, and the unsettling exposure of false confidence. He writes nothing, commands no faction, and holds no school in the formal sense, yet his influence is visible enough to trouble the city. Young men listen to him, some admire him, some imitate him badly. Some of those connected to him, especially Alcibiades and Critias, carry names heavy with political damage. That does not mean Socrates is responsible for their choices, but in a wounded democracy, association can become accusation. The formal charges against him concern impiety and the corruption of the young. Modern readers often want to turn the trial into a simple story of philosophy versus ignorance, or free thought versus religious superstition. But the reality is more complicated. Athens is not a city that hates intelligence. It is a city saturated with argument, drama, criticism, and intellectual experiment. It has tolerated sophists, comic mockery, bold speculation, and political debate of extraordinary intensity. Yet tolerance has limits, especially after trauma. The evidence remains incomplete because the trial is known through literary works shaped by memory, philosophy, and defense, not through a neutral transcript. Scholars still debate exactly how the jurors understood the charges and how much recent politics haunted the courtroom. What survives suggests that Socrates becomes a focal point for anxieties larger than himself. Impiety is not a minor matter in Athens. Religion is woven into civic identity, festivals, law, oath, sacrifice, war, and memory. To dishonour the gods is not merely to hold a private opinion, it can appear to threaten the city's relationship with divine order. The same Acropolis that bears the Parthenon is not a museum of beautiful ideas. It is sacred ground. The city's survival, victories, and rituals are framed through divine favour and obligation. A man who seems to question inherited beliefs, introduce strange divine signs, or undermine reverence can be perceived as more than eccentric. He can seem civically unsafe. That perception may be unfair, but it is historically understandable in a society where religion and politics are not separate worlds. The charge of corrupting the young cuts even closer to democratic fear. Athens depends on civic education, not in the modern classroom sense, but through family, festival, theatre, military service, law courts, and public example. Young citizens must learn how to speak, judge, obey laws, honour gods, and serve the polis. Socrates does not offer conventional training in success. He does not simply teach rhetoric for political advancement. Instead, he questions the very meaning of virtue, knowledge, courage, piety, and justice. To some, that is the highest service a thinker can offer. To others, especially after years of elite betrayal and political catastrophe, it may look like the loosening of every necessary bond. A city that has seen clever men lead it toward ruin may begin to fear cleverness itself. There is bitter irony here. Athens creates the conditions that make Socrates possible. Its democracy values speech. Its public spaces allow encounter. Its courts and assembly make arguments central to power. Its theatre teaches citizens to examine myth and morality. Its empire brings wealth, leisure, and contact with foreign ideas. Socrates is, in many ways, a product of Athens at its most alive. Yet the city also puts him on trial. The very culture that raises questioning into an art becomes afraid of the questioner. No single explanation fully accounts for this contradiction, because the trial is not only about one man's beliefs, it is about a democracy trying to recover from humiliation and deciding which forms of criticism it can survive. In the courtroom, Socrates does not behave like a man eager to soothe the jurors. Later accounts present him as unapologetic, probing, unwilling to flatter, and almost stubbornly committed to his role. He does not perform the usual emotional gestures expected from defendants seeking pity. He does not present himself as harmless. He insists, in effect, that his questioning has value. Whether every detail of the surviving speeches reflects the historical trial precisely remains uncertain. But the portrait is consistent with the deeper problem Socrates refuses to separate his life from his inquiry. To spare himself by abandoning the practice that defines him would be, in his eyes, a deeper defeat than death. The jury condemns him by a narrow margin, and when the penalty phase arrives, the situation worsens. Athenian legal procedure allows competing penalties to be proposed, and Socrates' response, as later remembered, does not offer the kind of humble compromise that might have saved him. The jurors vote for death. The city that has endured tyrants, plague, invasion, and civil violence now condemns an old philosopher to drink hemlock. The act is legal, public, and democratic. That is what makes it so troubling. Socrates is not murdered by a tyrant in a palace cellar. He's executed by a restored democracy through its own institutions. The death of Socrates becomes one of the most enduring symbols in Western thought, but symbols can become too clean. It is tempting to make him a martyr for pure reason, and Athens a villain of collective stupidity. That misses the tragic density of the event. Athens has reasons to be afraid, even if fear leads it badly. Socrates has reasons to question the city, even if his manner provokes hostility. The democracy has recently survived oligarchs who killed citizens and collaborators who damaged trust. Some of Socrates' associates are politically toxic. Religion, education, memory, and civic order feel fragile. Yet none of that fully justifies killing a man for questions. The trial reveals a democracy's capacity for self-defense and self-harm in the same gesture. Plato, who is still young at the time, never forgets. The execution of Socrates becomes a wound at the center of his philosophical life. In the works that follow, Socrates becomes more than a remembered teacher. He becomes a dramatic voice through which philosophy examines justice, knowledge, the soul, the city, and the dangerous instability of public opinion. Without the trial, philosophy would still exist, but its later shape might have been different. The death of Socrates gives philosophical inquiry a martyr, a method, and a warning. It asks whether a city governed by many can recognize wisdom when wisdom refuses to flatter it. It asks whether majority judgment can be just when the majority is wounded, proud, and afraid. Athens itself continues after the trial. The democracy does not collapse because Socrates dies. Its courts, festivals, trade, rhetoric, and political life go on. But something has been exposed. The city that celebrates free speech does not protect every form of speech equally. The city that teaches citizens to judge can judge wrongly. The city that defeats tyranny can still act harshly through lawful procedure. This is the difficult inheritance of Athens. It gives later civilizations the language of civic freedom, while also giving them one of the most famous examples of freedom turning against a voice of conscience. The trial of Socrates therefore belongs not at the edge of the Athenian story but near its centre. It gathers the themes that have been building since the beginning public speech: law, religion, education, fear of tyranny, suspicion of elites, faith in citizen judgment, and anxiety over the power of ideas. The rocky landscape that taught Athens friction has produced a city brilliant enough to question the foundations of human life, and insecure enough to punish the man who makes questioning his mission. Socrates dies, but the questions do not. They pass into Plato, into philosophy, into political thought, into every later society that asks how much criticism a free community must endure in order to remain free. Athens wounds itself, and from that wound, one of its deepest legacies begins to speak. After Socrates dies, Athens does not vanish into silence, and this is why its story refuses to end neatly. Many cities fall, lose wars, rebuild walls, change rulers, and leave behind broken stones. Athens does all of that, yet something in it remains unnervingly alive. Its empire is gone, its confidence has been bruised by plague, defeat, oligarchic terror, and the execution of a philosopher who becomes more powerful in memory than he ever was in public office. But the city continues to think, argue, teach, perform, trade, worship, and remember. It is no longer the unquestioned naval force that once commanded tribute across the Aegean, yet its defeated streets become one of the most influential intellectual landscapes in human history. the power of Athens begins to change form. What it can no longer hold with ships, it begins to hold with words. The 4th century BCE is often treated as an aftermath, as though the real Athens ends with Pericles, the Parthenon, the Peloponnesian War, and Socrates. That is misleading. The city after defeat remains politically active and culturally extraordinary. Democracy is restored after the 30, and although the trauma of civil conflict does not disappear, Athens attempts a remarkable act of civic repair. Amnesty helps prevent endless revenge among citizens, at least in principle, and the restored democracy becomes more legally careful, more aware of procedure, and more conscious of the dangers that had nearly destroyed it. Scholars still debate how far the post-war democracy differs from the radical democracy of the 5th century. But what survives in the record suggests a city trying to keep popular power while controlling its own volatility. This later democracy is not weak simply because the empire is lost. It is more cautious, more legalistic, and still deeply participatory. The assembly continues, courts continue, public finance, festivals, military policy, alliances, and civic honours continue. Orators become central figures in the life of the city, shaping political memory through speeches that are at once legal arguments, moral performances, and attempts to define what Athens has been and should become. Men like Lysias, Isocrates, Aeschines, and Demosthenes belong to this world of sharpened public language. Their speeches reveal a city still obsessed with citizenship, justice, reputation, law, betrayal, and freedom. Athens may have lost empire, but it has not lost the belief that public words can decide public life. Philosophy also changes after Socrates. Plato founds the Academy, creating a place where inquiry can become more sustained, more systematic, and more detached from the immediate noise of the agora, though never entirely free from the city's political shadow. Aristotle later studies there before founding his own school, the Lyceum, where investigation expands across ethics, politics, biology, logic, poetry, rhetoric, and the forms of knowledge itself. Neither man simply represents Athens in a narrow civic sense. Both are more complicated, both criticize aspects of democracy, and Aristotle himself is not an Athenian citizen. Yet the city makes their work possible in a profound way. Athens becomes a gathering place where argument, teaching, classification, and philosophical disagreement can take institutional form. This is one of the lesser-known continuities of Athenian influence even after political decline. The city remains a school for the Greek world and then for worlds beyond Greece. Its power migrates from fleets to classrooms, from tribute lists to manuscripts, from decrees to dialogues. The Academy and Lyceum are not democratic institutions in the same way as the assembly or courts, but they grow in the intellectual climate that Athens has created. The city's faith in speech, its obsession with law, its theatrical examination of human action, and its painful political failures all feed philosophical reflection. Plato imagines ideal cities partly because the real city has disappointed him. Aristotle analyzes constitutions because Greek political life offers so many living examples of order and disorder. Athens becomes not only a place where democracy happens, but a place where democracy can be criticized, defended, dissected, and remembered. Theatre also continues to carry Athenian memory outward. Tragedy and comedy remain among the city's most enduring gifts because they preserve not simply stories, but habits of emotional and political complexity. Later cultures inherit from Athens the idea that public performance can ask serious questions about justice, fate, pride, leadership, gender, family, war, and the limits of human knowledge, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes are not merely ancient authors. They become voices through which later civilizations learn to stage conflict without resolving it too quickly. The evidence remains incomplete for the full richness of performance culture, much of which is lost forever, but the surviving plays are enough to show a city that turns myth into civic thought. The stones remain as well. The Acropolis stands through Macedonian dominance, Hellenistic change, Roman admiration, late antique transformation, Byzantine worship, Ottoman rule, war, damage, excavation, restoration, and modern tourism. It is never simply one thing. A sacred citadel becomes a classical shrine, then a Christian church, then an Islamic and military space, then an archaeological monument, then a global symbol of heritage. Every age looks at it and sees a different Athens. The Parthenon, especially, becomes almost too famous for its own history. People see democracy, beauty, proportion, empire, loss, nationalism, conservation, or the fragile survival of the ancient world. No single explanation fully accounts for its symbolic power, because the building has outlived the meanings first attached to it. The agora, too, changes from lived civic space into buried memory and then into an excavated landscape where stones, foundations, inscriptions, wells, drains, pottery, coins, statues, and everyday objects restore the texture of public life. Archaeology brings Athens down from abstraction. Democracy was not only an idea, it occupied buildings. Philosophy was not only thought, it unfolded in walkable places. Law was not only principle, it depended on spaces where citizens gathered and listened. The recovery of the agora reminds the modern world that Athens was never only marble above the city, it was mud, dust, food stalls, workshops, administrative rooms, altars, gossip, legal anger, and ordinary movement. The legacy of Athens is therefore both immense and unstable. Later societies call upon Athens when they speak of democracy, citizenship, philosophy, theatre, history, rhetoric, and civic freedom. But they often simplify what they inherit. Athenian democracy is not modern democracy. It excludes most of the people living in the city. It depends on slavery, patriarchy, imperial wealth, and military power. It can act with brilliance and cruelty, courage and panic, openness and suspicion. Yet its achievement remains extraordinary because it creates, for a limited body of citizens, a system in which ordinary men participate directly in judgment, law, office, and policy at a scale and intensity almost unknown before. Its failures do not erase its daring. Its daring does not excuse its failures. That is why Athens still matters, not because it gives later history a perfect model, but because it gives later history a problem it cannot stop revisiting. How can free people govern themselves without being misled by fear, pride, wealth, anger, or gifted speakers? How can a city honour wisdom when wisdom is unpopular? How can public power remain accountable without becoming unstable? How can beauty, empire, law, and exclusion exist inside the same civilization? Athens does not answer these questions once and for all, it makes them unavoidable. In the end, Athens remains because it is unfinished. Its democracy falls and returns, its empire rises and collapses, its philosophers question its deepest assumptions, its theatre preserves its anxieties, its monuments outlive its power, its excavated spaces remind the world that ideas are made by people in particular places, under particular skies, with particular fears. The city born from thin soil and hard stone becomes fertile in memory, and long after its ships stop ruling the Aegean, Athens continues to do what it has always done best. It gathers the living around an argument that refuses to die. The light softens over the Acropolis, and the city below seems quieter now. The crowds fade. The voices of the assembly fall back into the stone. The jurors, sailors, potters, philosophers, priests, actors, generals, foreigners, labourers, and citizens all recede into distance, leaving only fragments, a name on an ostracon, a worn step in the agora, a broken inscription, a column catching the last warmth of the sun. Athens no longer needs to be imagined as perfect. It was never perfect. It was human, intensely human, filled with ambition and fear, generosity and exclusion, intelligence and error. What remains is not a simple lesson, but a long echo. A hard landscape shaped a restless people. A sacred hill became a memory of survival. A poor soil pushed eyes toward the sea. Debt, rivalry, tyranny, reform, war, plague, empire, theatre, philosophy, and defeat all entered the same story, each leaving a mark that could not be fully erased. The birth of democracy was not clean. It came through argument, danger, compromise, and pressure. It promised freedom to some while denying it to others. It created spaces where citizens could judge powerful men, and it created moments when the city itself judged badly. That is why its legacy feels alive rather than finished. Across centuries, Athens becomes less a place than a question carried from one civilization to another. Its marble breaks, but its problems endure. Its empire disappears, but its words travel. Its philosophers die, but their questions keep moving through classrooms, books, courts, parliaments, theatres, and private thoughts. Every age that invokes Athens chooses what to remember and what to forget. Some remember the Parthenon in sunlight. Some remember the trial of Socrates. Some remember the assembly, the fleet, the tragedies, the laughter of comedy, or the quiet work of archaeologists brushing dust from the floors of public life. And beneath all of it, the older image remains Attica before dawn, stony and dry, a place that does not seem destined for greatness. A hill rises over the plain. The sea waits beyond the land. The soil gives little easily. Yet from that difficult ground comes a city that teaches the world how powerful, dangerous, fragile, and necessary public life can be. Athens fades into evening, but the argument it began remains awake, like a small flame held carefully against the dark.